In the silence between heartbeats, wild horses can hear what we cannot. They run beneath storm-laden skies carrying secrets older than words. But what happens when someone learns to listen? When a child's dreams become windows to a truth others have tried to bury. For 3 years, Sophie Morgan has lived with the ghost of her mother, with whispered accusations that can never be answered, with a connection to horses that makes her both gifted and isolated. But tonight, as thunder cracks across Shadow Creek Valley, something is awakening. A black stallion stands motionless in the rain eyes, reflecting ancient wisdom as he watches a young girl's window. A silver pendant pulses with forgotten memories. And somewhere in the darkness, a woman who should be dead reaches out through the veil of storm and secrets. The wild are calling, and for those with the courage to listen, nothing will ever be the same again. Lightning cracked the night sky, illuminating the silhouette of a woman running through the storm. Rain poured mercilessly, each drop stinging like tiny needles against her skin. Eliza Morgan limped forward, her right leg bleeding from a wound that left a trail of crimson in the mud. Her breathing came in ragged gasps as she clutched a USB drive in one hand and a silver pendant in the other, her knuckles white from the force of her grip. Another flash of lightning revealed figures in the distance. Maxwell Reed stood tall among his men, their dark shapes cutting through the curtain of rain like predators on the hunt. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew what they wanted, what they would do if they caught her. The thunder rumbled, and in that moment he appeared. A black horse materialized from the darkness, seemingly born from the storm itself. The stallion's coat was darker than midnight, his eyes reflecting an ancient wisdom that transcended his animal form. Phantom, they called him in whispers throughout the valley. The horse that could never be caught, never be tamed. Eliza staggered toward the magnificent creature, her hand outstretched. "Protect Sophie," she whispered, her voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "Find her!" Phantom lowered his head, allowing Eliza to climb onto his back. With one last look at the approaching men, the black horse turned and galloped into the shadows, carrying Eliza away from her pursuers and into the unknown. Sophie Morgan bolted upright in bed, gasping for air. Her small chest heaved as she fought to control her breathing. The 11-year-old's forehead was slick with sweat, her dark hair clinging to her pale skin. Through the open window of her tiny bedroom at Wild Heart Rehabilitation Center, she could hear the distant sound of hoofbeats fading into the night. Just a dream, she told herself, the same dream she'd been having for weeks now. With trembling hands, Sophie reached for the inhaler on her nightstand, taking a quick puff to ease the tightness in her lungs. Her mild asthma always flared during moments of stress or excitement. Once her breathing steadied, she switched on her bedside lamp and pulled out her sketchbook from beneath her pillow. The dream was already fading, but she needed to capture it before it disappeared completely. Her pencil moved across the paper with practiced ease, sketching the outline of a woman running in the rain, a horse emerging from the darkness. When she finished, Sophie stared at the drawing, a chill running down her spine. It matched the final sketch in her mother's notebook, the one she'd found hidden beneath a loose floorboard last month almost perfectly. Morning light filtered through the faded curtains of Sophie's room, casting a golden glow across her collection of horse figurines. The sound of pots and pans clanging in the kitchen below finally roused her from her fitful sleep. She'd spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, the dream replaying in fragments whenever she closed her eyes. Sophie dressed quickly in worn jeans and her favorite blue t-shirt, the one with a white horse silhouette across the chest. Her mother had given it to her for her 10th birthday just 3 months before the accident, before everything changed. The wooden stairs creaked under Sophie's feet as she made her way down to the kitchen. The Wild Heart Rehabilitation Center had once been a thriving horse rescue, but these days it was barely hanging on. The persistent drought that had plagued Shadow Creek Valley for 3 years had taken its toll on everyone, especially small operations like theirs. "Good morning, Eliza," Ruth Carter called out without turning from the stove where she was scrambling eggs. "Did you sleep well?" Sophie froze at the bottom of the stairs. Her grandmother had been mixing up names more frequently lately, calling Sophie by her mother's name, forgetting small things like where she'd left her reading glasses or what day of the week it was. "It's Sophie, Grandma," she said softly, crossing the kitchen to gently touch Ruth's arm. Mom's not here, remember? Ruth's shoulders stiffened. At 67, she still stood tall, her posture a remnant of her military nursing days. Silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her weathered hands moved with purpose despite the slight tremor that had developed in recent months. Of course, Ruth said, blinking rapidly. Sophie, I know that. She turned back to the stove, her mouth set in a tight line. Just a slip of the tongue. Sophie sat at the kitchen table, tracing the wood grain with her fingertip. She wanted to ask about the dream, about her mother's notebook, about all the things Ruth never seemed to want to talk about. But the tension in her grandmother's shoulders warned her to stay quiet. I heard hoofbeats last night, Sophie said instead, accepting the plate of eggs Ruth placed in front of her. From the north pasture. Ruth's hand paused midway through pouring orange juice. Probably just a stray. The drought's driving more wild herds down from the mountains looking for water. Could it have been him, Phantom? Ruth's expression hardened. Phantom is just a story, Sophie. A legend the valley folks made up to draw tourists to the harvest festival? But Mrs. Winters at the general store said, Mrs. Winters says a lot of things. Ruth sat down across from Sophie, her coffee mug cradled between her palms. Eat your breakfast. You'll be late for school. Sophie pushed her eggs around her plate, appetite diminishing. This was how it always went. Every time she tried to bring up anything related to her mother or the horses her mother had studied, Ruth would shut down the conversation. 3 years since the accident, and they still danced around the subject of Eliza Morgan, as if saying her name might conjure a ghost. I found Mom's old notebook, Sophie said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Under the floorboard in her office. Ruth's coffee mug hit the table with a sharp clack. You shouldn't be going through her things. She was my mother. Sophie's voice cracked. I just want to know more about her, about what she was working on. What your mother was working on got her killed. Ruth's words hung in the air between them, sharp and cutting, then softer. I'm sorry, Sophie. That wasn't fair. Sophie pushed away from the table, eyes burning with unshed tears. She loved those horses more than she loved me. That's what we fought about the day before. She swallowed hard. The last thing I said to her was that I hated how she always put horses before me. And then she was gone. Ruth reached across the table, her hand covering Sophie's smaller one. Your mother loved you more than anything in this world, Sophie. More than her research, more than the horses, more than her own life. There was something in Ruth's voice, a certainty, a knowing that made Sophie look up. For a moment she thought her grandmother might finally tell her something, anything about what Eliza had been working on before she died. But Ruth just squeezed her hand once and stood clearing the plates. You'd better get ready for school, Ruth said, turning her back to Sophie as she began washing dishes. Bus will be here in 20 minutes. With a sigh, Sophie trudged back upstairs to gather her school books, the weight of unspoken words and buried secrets pressing down on her slender shoulders. Shadow Creek Middle School loomed before Sophie, a 2-story brick building that housed barely 200 students. In a town as small as Shadow Creek, everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew that Sophie Morgan was the girl whose mother had died in a mysterious accident 3 years ago. Hey, horse girl, Lizzie Peterson called out as Sophie walked across the schoolyard. Heard your grandma's farm is going to get shut down soon. My dad says she can't pay her bills. Sophie kept her eyes fixed on the ground, quickening her pace. Lizzie and her friends had been making her life miserable since 4th grade, when Sophie had corrected Lizzie's presentation about horses in front of the entire class. Ignore her, Sophie muttered to herself. Just ignore her. Is it true wild horses talk to you in your sleep? Lizzie continued, her friends giggling behind her. Maybe you can ask them for money to save your farm. Sophie felt her chest tightening, the familiar precursor to an asthma attack. She fumbled in her backpack for her inhaler, but Lizzie snatched her bag away, upending its contents onto the dusty ground. Oops, Lizzie said with mock concern. So clumsy of me. Sophie dropped to her knees, scrambling to collect her scattered books and papers. Her breath was coming in short, painful gasps now. Where was her inhaler? That's enough, Lizzie. A firm voice cut through the schoolyard chatter. Mrs. Bennett, Sophie's English teacher, stood there with her arms crossed. In her late 30s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, she was one of the few teachers who seemed to genuinely care about her students. "Go to class, all of you," Mrs. Bennett said, her tone leaving no room for argument. The group of girls dispersed, Lizzie shooting Sophie a venomous look over her shoulder. Mrs. Bennett knelt beside Sophie, helping her gather the last of her things. "Are you all right? Do you need your inhaler?" Sophie nodded, still struggling to breathe. Mrs. Bennett reached into her own bag and pulled out an emergency inhaler. She kept one on hand ever since Sophie's bad attack during last year's field trip. After taking 2 puffs, Sophie's breathing began to ease. "Thank you," she whispered. "Some people," Mrs. Bennett said, helping Sophie to her feet, "are threatened by those who are different, who see the world in ways they don't understand." She walked Sophie to her classroom, her hand a reassuring presence on Sophie's shoulder. Before they parted, Mrs. Bennett handed her a book. "I thought you might enjoy this," she said. "It's about the wild horses of the American West, their history, their struggles, their incredible resilience." Sophie took the book, running her fingers over the embossed cover. A black stallion reared against a stormy sky, its mane flowing like dark fire. "Thank you," Sophie said again, clutching the book to her chest. Mrs. Bennett smiled. "You know, Sophie, your mother came to speak to my class once about her research. She was a remarkable woman, passionate, brilliant. She saw things in horses that others missed." She paused. "You have her eyes, the same way of looking at the world." Before Sophie could ask what she meant, the first bell rang, and Mrs. Bennett hurried off to her own classroom, leaving Sophie standing in the hallway with more questions than answers. The town of Shadow Creek was buzzing with activity as Sophie walked home from the bus stop that afternoon. Colorful banners hung across Main Street announcing the annual Horse Harvest Festival just 2 weeks away. For generations, the festival had been the town's biggest event, culminating in an auction where ranchers from all over the state came to bid on the wild horses that had been rounded up from the surrounding mountains. This year's festival seemed bigger than ever, with new posters plastered on every storefront window. "Reed Ecological Enterprises presents a charity auction and concert to save Shadow Creek," the posters proclaimed in bold letters. Sophie paused in front of the general store, studying a particularly large poster featuring a photograph of a distinguished-looking man in his early 50s. Maxwell Reed smiled confidently at the camera. His salt and pepper hair perfectly styled his tailored suit, suggesting wealth and influence. "Quite the production they're planning this year," said a voice behind her. Sophie turned to find Joseph White Cloud standing there, leaning on his hand-carved walking stick. The 80-year-old Native American elder was something of a local legend himself, known for his knowledge of the valley's history and his collection of traditional stories. "Mr. White Cloud," Sophie said, smiling. Unlike most adults who treated her with awkward sympathy or indifference, the elder always spoke to her as if she were his equal. "Are you going to the festival?" The old man's weathered face creased with a frown as he studied the poster. "I've attended every horse harvest festival since I was younger than you, child. But this year," he tapped Reed's face with one gnarled finger, "this man brings change. Not all change is for the better." "He says he's going to save the valley from the drought," Sophie said, repeating what she'd heard around town. "With some new technology his company developed." White Cloud made a soft sound that might have been a laugh or a scoff. "The earth has her own rhythms, her own ways of healing. Men who think they can control nature often discover too late that they understand very little." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as workers across the street erected a stage in the town square. "Have you seen him?" Sophie asked suddenly. "Phantom, the black horse." White Cloud's dark eyes flickered to her face, something unreadable in their depths. "Why do you ask, child?" Sophie hesitated, then decided to trust the elder. "I've been dreaming about him almost every night, and last night I heard hoofbeats near our property." The old man studied her for a long moment, then glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers. He lowered his voice. "The horse your people call Phantom has been seen more frequently these past months, always near your grandmother's land." Sophie's heart quickened. So he's real, not just a legend. Some legends walk among us, Sophie Morgan. White Cloud's eyes seem to look through her into her. They wait for the right moment to reveal their purpose. Before Sophie could ask what he meant, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. The driver's window lowered, revealing Maxwell Reed himself, his smile just as perfect in person as in his photographs. Mr. White Cloud, Reed called out, his voice smooth and cultured. Just the man I was hoping to see. I'd like to discuss your participation in our cultural heritage segment of the festival. White Cloud's expression remained impassive. I will consider it, Mr. Reed. Reed's gaze shifted to Sophie, his smile never wavering. And who might this young lady be? Something cold settled in Sophie's stomach as those keen eyes assessed her. She felt like a horse at auction, being evaluated for her worth. Sophie Morgan, White Cloud said before she could speak. Ruth Carter's granddaughter. A flash of recognition crossed Reed's face. Morgan, Eliza Morgan's daughter. Sophie nodded, unable to find her voice. Your mother was a brilliant researcher, Reed said, his tone softening with what seemed like genuine admiration. Her work on equine cognition was groundbreaking. Such a tragic loss. You knew my mother, Sophie asked, finally finding her voice. We collaborated briefly, Reed replied. Her understanding of horse behavior was unparalleled. He glanced at his watch. I'm afraid I must be going. Pleasure to meet you, Sophie. I hope to see you both at the festival. As the SUV pulled away, Sophie turned to White Cloud. He knew my mom. The elder's face was grim. Knowledge is not the same as understanding, child. Remember that. With those cryptic words, White Cloud patted her shoulder and continued down the street, leaving Sophie with the uncomfortable feeling that there was much more to the story than anyone was telling her. The Wildheart Rehabilitation Center sat on 30 acres of land that had been in Ruth's family for generations. Once verdant pastures were now dusty and brown from the prolonged drought. The barn's red paint faded and peeling. Only 2 horses remained in their care, an elderly mare named Willow and a 3-year-old gelding recovering from a barbed wire injury. As Sophie approached the gravel driveway, she noticed an unfamiliar truck parked beside Ruth's ancient pickup. A tall man in his 40s stood talking with her grandmother near the barn, gesturing animatedly. Sophie, Ruth called, waving her over. Come meet Dr. Nathan Foster. He's our new veterinarian. The man turned, offering Sophie a friendly smile. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a beard that was more salt than pepper. Sophie, he said, extending his hand, I've heard a lot about you. Your grandmother says you have quite a way with horses. Sophie shook his hand, studying him curiously. Our old vet retired to Arizona. Dr. Mills, yes, Foster nodded. He actually recommended me for the position. I've just moved to the area from Colorado. Dr. Foster was just telling me about his experience with wild horse rehabilitation, Ruth explained. He's worked with several conservation programs over the years, including one run by your mother, Foster added softly. I was a student of Eliza's work before I ever met her in person. Her research on acoustic communication between wild herds was revolutionary. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. Here was someone who not only knew her mother, but had worked with her, someone who might finally give her some answers. You knew my mom, Sophie asked, echoing her earlier question to Reed. Foster's expression softened. I did. I was fortunate enough to study under her for a summer about 5 years ago. He glanced at Ruth, something unspoken passing between them. Your mother changed how we understand horse communication. Her work on what she called echo frequencies opened up entirely new avenues of research. Echo frequencies, Sophie repeated. What's that? Again, that look between Foster and Ruth. Perhaps another time, Ruth interjected. Dr. Foster needs to check on Willow's arthritis before he goes. Foster seemed about to say something else, but then nodded. Of course. Why don't you show me to her stall? Ruth. As they walked toward the barn, Sophie noticed Foster pull something from his pocket, a photograph. She couldn't hear what he said, but she saw her grandmother's face pale as she looked at whatever was in the picture. Instead of following them, Sophie turned toward the house. Her mother's old office was at the back, a small room that had been left largely untouched since her death. Ruth rarely went in there, and Sophie had only recently begun exploring it in secret. The office was dusty sunlight streaming through the grimy window to illuminate dancing particles in the air. Bookshelves lined one wall filled with texts on equine behavior, cognition, and biology. A desk sat beneath the window, its surface still cluttered with papers and notebooks, as if Eliza had just stepped out for a moment and would return any second. Sophie crossed to the loose floorboard beneath the desk, prying it up with practiced fingers. The hiding space contained her mother's private journal and a small USB drive that Sophie hadn't yet found a way to access. She took out the journal, flipping through pages filled with her mother's elegant handwriting. Most entries detailed observations of wild horse behavior, with particular focus on their vocalizations and what Eliza called subsonic communication patterns. Sophie had read through most of it already, understanding little of the technical language, but treasuring the connection to her mother all the same. Near the back of the journal, the entries became more cryptic. References to Project Echo appeared frequently, along with mentions of Reed's research and concerning applications. The final entry, dated just days before Eliza's death, was the most disturbing MR proceeding with Phase 2, despite ethical concerns. Suspect true purpose extends beyond stated goals. If my suspicions are correct, the technology could be weaponized. Sound is control undetectable, insidious. Must secure proof before going public. Sophie is the key, her sensitivity, her connection. Keep her safe at all costs. Below these words was the sketch: the woman running in the rain, the dark horse emerging from shadows. The same image from Sophie's recurring dream. The sound of the back door closing startled Sophie. She quickly returned the journal to its hiding place and replaced the floorboard. As she slipped out of the office, she heard Ruth's voice from the kitchen. "Should have told me you were coming. Nathan," Ruth was saying, her voice tense. "It's been 3 years. Why now?" "Because it's starting again," Foster replied, his tone urgent. "The signs are all there. Reed's charity concert, the sudden interest in wild horse conservation, the weather manipulation tests." "You can't know that," Ruth interrupted. "There's no proof." "There is. That's why I'm here." "Eliza left evidence, Ruth. I think she hid it somewhere on this property before she, what Ray?" Ruth's voice had a dangerous edge. "Choose your next words very carefully, Doctor." A long silence followed, broken only by the ticking of the old kitchen clock. "I'm sorry," Foster finally said. "I know how painful this must be for you, for Sophie. But if Reed is restarting Project Echo, we need to find what Eliza hid before he does." "And why should I trust you now?" Ruth asked, bitterness seeping into her words. "You weren't there when she needed allies, when she was trying to expose him." "That's not fair, Ruth. I was trying to verify her claims through proper channels. I never thought Reed would—" Foster stopped abruptly. "Is that Sophie?" Sophie realized she'd been holding her breath, her body tense as she strained to hear. She quickly moved away from the door and pretended to be coming in from outside just as Ruth appeared in the hallway. "Sophie," Ruth said, her face composed once more. "Dr. Foster is leaving now. Why don't you go start your homework while I see him out?" Sophie nodded, watching as Foster gathered his bag. The veterinarian paused at the door, turning back to look at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "It was nice meeting you, Sophie," he said. "I'll be back next week to check on Willow." He hesitated, then added, "You look so much like your mother." After he left, Sophie sat at the kitchen table, unable to focus on her math worksheet. Too many questions swirled in her mind. What was Project Echo? What had her mother discovered that was so dangerous? And why did she write that Sophie was the key? Ruth busied herself preparing dinner, her movements sharp and efficient, betraying her agitation. Sophie watched her grandmother slice carrots with military precision, debating whether to confront her with what she'd overheard. "Grandma," she began cautiously, "Dr. Foster seemed to know Mom pretty well." Ruth's knife paused momentarily before resuming its rhythmic chopping. "He worked with her briefly years ago. He said something about echo frequencies. What did Mom's research actually involve?" Ruth sighed, setting down the knife and turning to face Sophie. "Your mother studied how horses communicate over long distances, how they can sense things beyond human perception. She believed they had abilities we've only begun to understand. She hesitated. Some of her theories were controversial. Samyawanan. Like what? Like the idea that certain horses, particularly wild ones who've never been domesticated, can form telepathic bonds with humans who are receptive. Ruth shook her head. The scientific community thought she was reaching too far beyond established research parameters. But you believed her, Sophie pressed. A sad smile touched Ruth's lips. I believed she believed it. Eliza was passionate. When she got an idea in her head, there was no stopping her. The smile faded. Sometimes passion makes us blind to the risks we're taking. Sophie wanted to ask more, but Ruth turned back to her cooking, signaling the end of the conversation. As usual, she'd been given just enough information to create more questions than answers. After dinner, Ruth retreated to her bedroom, as she often did in the evenings. Sophie helped with the dishes, then slipped outside to check on the horses before bed. The night air was cool against her skin, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. In the distance, thunder rumbled. Perhaps the storm they'd been promised for days was finally approaching. The valley desperately needed rain. As Sophie crossed the yard toward the barn, she heard a soft melody drifting through an open window. Ruth was singing something she rarely did anymore. Sophie paused, listening. The tune was hauntingly beautiful, a folk song Sophie had never heard before. She crept closer to the window, catching fragments of lyrics about wild horses running free under moonlight, about ancient bonds between humans and animals, about secrets carried on the wind. When the song ended, Sophie heard her grandmother's voice speaking softly, as if to herself. All the women in our family know this song, Eliza. Your great-grandmother taught it to me. I taught it to you, and someday— A pause. Someday, Sophie will teach it to her daughter. Error. Curiosity piqued, Sophie continued to the barn. Inside, Willow nickered softly in greeting, and the younger horse Thunder poked his head over his stall door. Sophie gave them each an apple from her pocket, stroking their velvet noses. Did you hear that song? She whispered to Willow. Have you heard it before? The elderly mare blinked her gentle eyes as if she understood perfectly. Sophie was about to return to the house when she heard the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats approaching from the north pasture. Her heart began to race. Moving quietly, she slipped out the barn's side door and into the darkness. The moon had risen, casting a silver glow across the drought-stricken land. Sophie made her way toward the sound, climbing over the fence into the empty north pasture. The hoofbeats grew louder, then suddenly stopped. Sophie froze, straining her eyes against the darkness. Then she saw a shadow darker than the night standing motionless at the far edge of the pasture. Two eyes gleamed in the moonlight, fixed on her with unsettling intelligence. Phantom? She whispered, her voice barely audible. The horse didn't move, continuing to watch her with those knowing eyes. Sophie took a cautious step forward, then another. The black stallion remained still, as if waiting for her. She began to hum the melody she'd heard Ruth singing, the notes rising intuitively to her lips, though she'd only heard it once. The horse's ears pricked forward, head tilting slightly. Sophie took another step, still humming. The stallion snorted softly, pawing the ground once. Then, just as Sophie came within 20 feet, another sound cut through the night, the slam of a car door from the front of the property. The horse's head jerked up, nostrils flaring. Before Sophie could react, Phantom turned and galloped away, vanishing into the darkness as silently as he had appeared. Heart pounding, Sophie ran back toward the house, keeping to the shadows. As she rounded the corner, she saw Ruth standing on the porch, speaking to someone in a car with its headlights off. Sophie crouched behind a juniper bush, watching as her grandmother passed something to the visitor, an envelope. The car backed out of the driveway moments later, its taillights disappearing down the road. Ruth stood motionless on the porch for a long time, her face tilted up to the stars. Then she pulled something from her pocket, a letter, and read it by the porch light, her expression unreadable. When she finished, she carefully folded the paper and returned to the house. Sophie waited until she heard Ruth's bedroom door close before creeping back inside. Whatever secrets her grandmother was keeping, they were piling up faster than Sophie could unravel them. The next morning dawned gray and humid, the promised storm still gathering strength. Sophie sat at the breakfast table, pushing cereal around her bowl, debating whether to ask Ruth about the mysterious visitor. "You're quiet this morning," Ruth observed, pouring herself a second cup of coffee. Sophie looked up. I heard you singing last night. It was pretty. Ruth's hand stilled momentarily. An old folk song, been in the family for generations. Will you teach it to me sometime? Something flickered in Ruth's eyes, surprise perhaps, or wariness. When you're older, perhaps. I'm 11, Sophie pointed out. Mom was only 4 when you taught her. Ruth's eyebrows rose. How would you know that? Sophie bit her lip, realizing her mistake. I found some of Mom's old journals. She wrote about it. Instead of the anger Sophie expected, Ruth's expression softened. You're a lot like her, you know. Always searching for answers, never satisfied with half-truths. She sighed. Yes, I taught her young. She had a gift for music and for understanding animals. Just like you. Before Sophie could respond, a commotion outside caught their attention. Barking dogs raised voices, the sound of hooves on gravel. Ruth was on her feet, instantly moving with a speed that belied her age. Sophie followed her to the front door. In the driveway stood Dr. Foster, and beside him a horse unlike any Sophie had ever seen. The filly was perhaps a year old, her coat a pale gold that seemed to shimmer even in the gray morning light. Her mane and tail were almost white, flowing like liquid silver. But what struck Sophie most were the animal's eyes, large, expressive, and filled with terror. She showed up at my clinic this morning, Foster explained as Ruth and Sophie approached cautiously. Someone left her tied to the fence. She's wild and injured. Now Sophie could see the wounds on the young horse's flank and neck cuts, and abrasions, some fresh, others partially healed. Around her neck was a strange mark, a brand or tattoo that read E9. She won't let anyone near her, Foster continued. Tried to bite 2 of my assistants. I thought, well, I remembered what you told me about Sophie. The filly danced nervously at the end of the lead rope. Foster held her eyes rolling white with fear. Something twisted in Sophie's chest at the sight of the beautiful, terrified creature. Without thinking, she stepped forward, ignoring Ruth's warning hand on her shoulder. The filly's gaze locked onto Sophie, nostrils flaring. Easy, Sophie murmured, holding out her hand, palm down the way her mother had taught her. I won't hurt you. The filly tossed her head, pulling against the rope. But she didn't try to run as Sophie moved closer, one slow step at a time. That's it, Sophie continued, her voice soft and melodic. You're safe here. To everyone's amazement, the filly gradually stilled her breathing, slowing as Sophie approached. When Sophie finally stood before her, the young horse lowered her head, nostrils fluttering against Sophie's outstretched hand. Extraordinary, Foster breathed carefully, releasing the lead rope. She's completely wild yet she trusts Sophie. Ruth finished, a complex emotion crossing her face. Just like they always trusted Eliza, Foster said quietly. Sophie barely heard them. She was lost in the filly's gaze, feeling a connection she couldn't explain, as if she could sense the young horse's emotions, her fear, her confusion, and beneath it all, a desperate longing for something lost. Aurora, Sophie whispered the name, coming to her from nowhere. Your name is Aurora. The filly's ears pricked forward at the sound, and she gave a soft, nickering response. She needs medical attention, Foster said, breaking the spell. That wound on her neck is concerning. With Sophie's help, they were able to lead Aurora to an empty stall in the barn. The filly remained calm as long as Sophie stayed close, but grew agitated whenever Foster approached with his medical bag. I've never seen anything like it, the veterinarian said, watching, as Sophie stroked Aurora's neck, keeping her still, while Ruth cleaned the wound. It's as if they've known each other forever. The women in our family have always had a way with horses, Ruth said tersely, especially the wild ones. Foster examined the strange mark on Aurora's neck more closely. This isn't a traditional brand. It looks almost like a laboratory designation. He carefully parted the golden hair around the mark, revealing a small lump beneath the skin. There's something here, some kind of implant. Ruth's expression darkened. An identification chip. Maybe, Foster said, though he sounded doubtful. But it's larger than standard microchips and positioned oddly. He looked up at Ruth. I need to remove it. Whatever it is, it doesn't belong there. The The minor surgical procedure took place in the barn with Sophie keeping Aurora calm by singing softly the same melody Ruth had sung the night before, the notes coming to her as if she'd known them all her life. Foster worked quickly, extracting a small device from beneath the filly's skin. He held it up to the light, frowning. This isn't a standard tracking chip. It's some kind of sophisticated transmitter. Who would put that in a wild horse? Sophie asked, still stroking Aurora's neck. Ruth and Foster exchanged a look. Someone who wanted to monitor her movements, Foster said carefully. And possibly more than that. These surgical scars on her head. He traced faint lines near Aurora's ears that Sophie hadn't noticed before. Someone's been experimenting on this horse. Aurora trembled beneath Sophie's hand, as if understanding his words. Sophie leaned close to the filly's ear. No one will hurt you again, she promised in a whisper. I won't let them. As Foster bandaged the extraction site, Ruth pulled him aside, speaking in hushed tones Sophie couldn't quite catch. Their faces were grave, their gestures tense. Sophie turned her attention back to Aurora. Where did you come from? She murmured. What happened to you? The filly gazed at her with those intelligent eyes, and for a moment, Sophie had the strangest sensation, as if Aurora was trying to tell her something. An image flashed in her mind, a black stallion running through the night, a laboratory with bright lights, a man's face partially obscured. Sophie gasped, stepping back. The image vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Sophie, Ruth called, noticing her reaction. Are you all right? I'm fine, Sophie said automatically, though her heart was racing. Just a little dizzy. Later that afternoon, after Foster had left with promises to return, soon Sophie sat on a hay bale outside Aurora's stall, sketching the filly in her notebook. Ruth approached with a mug of hot chocolate, sitting down beside her. She's settling in well, Ruth observed. Thanks to you. Sophie nodded, adding details to Aurora's expressive eyes. She was so scared when she arrived. I could feel it like her fear was my own. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Sophie, there's something I need to ask you. Something important. She took a deep breath. Have you been having strange dreams lately, or experiencing things that are hard to explain? Sophie's pencil stilled. Like what? Like knowing things you shouldn't know. Feeling connections to animals that seem deeper than normal? Seeing images in your mind that don't seem like your own thoughts? Sophie's throat went dry. How could Ruth know about the flash she'd experienced with Aurora, about the dreams of Phantom and her mother? Why are you asking me this? Sophie countered, avoiding a direct answer. Ruth's weathered hand covered Sophie's. Because your mother experienced the same things. It runs in our family, this connection to horses, especially wild ones. She paused. Some people wouldn't understand. Some might even try to use it for their own purposes. Like who? Sophie asked, though a name was already forming in her mind. There are people who see unique abilities as things to be exploited, not treasured. Ruth squeezed Sophie's hand. Promise me you'll be careful. Don't tell anyone about your connection with Aurora, not even Dr. Foster. But he seems to know Mom, to have worked with her. Even so, Ruth's expression was unyielding. Sometimes the fewer people who know a secret, the safer that secret remains. Sophie wanted to argue, to demand more answers, but something in her grandmother's eyes stopped her. For the first time, Sophie recognized not stubbornness in Ruth's reticence, but fear. I promise, Sophie said finally. Ruth nodded, seemingly satisfied. She rose to leave, but hesitated. That song you were singing to Aurora earlier, where did you learn it? Sophie looked up, meeting her grandmother's gaze steadily. You sang it last night, by the window. Something like pride flickered across Ruth's face. One hearing and you remembered it perfectly. She touched Sophie's cheek gently. Yes, you are very much your mother's daughter. As Ruth walked away, Sophie turned back to her drawing, but her mind was elsewhere, turning over her grandmother's words, connecting them with fragments from her mother's journal, with Foster's comments, with the strange mark on Aurora's neck. Project Echo. Reed's research. Sophie is the key. Her mother's final journal entry echoed in her thoughts. What were you trying to tell me, Mom? Sophie whispered. What were you afraid of? Aurora nickered softly from her stall, her golden head extended toward Sophie. Those knowing eyes seemed to hold answers. If only Sophie could understand them. The sky darkened as evening approached, the promised storm finally rolling in from the mountains. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Sophie helped Ruth with the evening chores, securing loose items around the property that might blow away in high winds. Going to be a bad one, Ruth commented, looking up at the gathering clouds. First real storm in months. They had just finished when a sleek car pulled into the driveway, the same black SUV Sophie had seen in town the day before. Maxwell Reed stepped out immaculately dressed despite the threatening weather. "Mrs. Carter," he called, approaching with a charming smile. "I hope I'm not intruding." Ruth's posture stiffened. "Mr. Reed, this is unexpected. I was in the area and thought I'd stop by." His gaze swept over the property, assessing. "I've always admired this place. Such potential." Sophie hung back, watching the exchange from the porch steps. There was something predatory in Reed's smile that made her skin crawl. "What can I do for you, Mr. Reed?" Ruth asked, her tone cool. "I wanted to personally invite you to our charity auction next week," Reed said, producing an envelope from his jacket pocket. "VIP tickets, of course. As a respected member of the local horse community, your presence would mean a great deal." Ruth accepted the envelope without opening it. "That's very generous." "Not at all. In fact, I have a proposition that might interest you." Reed glanced at the weathered barn, the faded sign for Wild Heart Rehabilitation Center. "I understand you've fallen on hard times since Eliza's passing. The drought hasn't helped matters, I'm sure." "We manage," Ruth said stiffly. Of course. But imagine what you could do with proper funding. State-of-the-art facilities, expanded capacity." Reed's smile widened. "My foundation is looking to partner with an established local operation for our conservation initiative. Wild Heart would be perfect." Sophie could see her grandmother weighing the offer, torn between suspicion and practical necessity. "Why us?" Ruth asked bluntly. "There are larger operations in the valley." "Let's just say I had great respect for Eliza's work. Supporting her legacy seems appropriate." A sudden gust of wind brought the first raindrops, large and heavy. Reed glanced at the sky. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation inside." Ruth hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Briefly, the storm's coming in fast." As they moved toward the house, Reed noticed Sophie for the first time. His smile shifted subtly as he addressed her. "Ah, Sophie, we meet again. How are you enjoying Mrs. Bennett's book?" Sophie blinked in surprise. "How did you know about that?" "Mrs. Bennett mentioned it when I visited the school earlier this week. I'm sponsoring their new library, you know." Reed's eyes narrowed slightly. "She speaks very highly of you. Says you have your mother's intuition with horses." Before Sophie could respond, the sound of a frightened whinny came from the barn. Aurora was calling out, her voice high and panicked. "Excuse me," Sophie said, already turning away. "I need to check on our new arrival." "New arrival?" Reed's voice sharpened with interest. "A rescued filly," Ruth said quickly. "Abandoned case. Nothing special." Sophie hurried to the barn, glad for the excuse to escape Reed's unsettling presence. Inside, she found Aurora pacing, her stall, eyes wide with fear. The young horse calmed somewhat at Sophie's approach, but continued to toss her head anxiously. "What's wrong, girl?" Sophie murmured, stroking the golden neck. "Is it just the storm?" Aurora's gaze kept darting to the barn door as if watching for something or someone. Sophie felt that strange connection again, a flutter of emotion that didn't seem to be her own danger. Hide. Run. The barn door creaked open behind her. Sophie turned to find Reed standing there, observing with keen interest. "Remarkable animal," he said, moving closer, despite Aurora's obvious distress. "Where did you find her?" "She was abandoned," Sophie said, repeating Ruth's explanation. "Dr. Foster brought her here this morning." Reed reached the stall door, his eyes fixed on Aurora, with an intensity that made Sophie step protectively in front of the filly. "May I?" he asked, reaching toward Aurora. Before Sophie could object, Aurora let out a terrified squeal and reared up, striking the stall door with her front hooves. Reed jumped back just in time to avoid being hit. "Spirited," he commented, brushing dust from his sleeve. "And that coloring quite unusual for a wild horse." His gaze shifted to the bandage on Aurora's neck. What happened there? She was injured when we found her, Sophie said, keeping her voice steady, despite the growing unease in her stomach. Dr. Foster treated her. Reed nodded, but his eyes lingered on the bandage, narrowing slightly. Foster, you say? Nathan Foster. You know him. Our paths have crossed. Reed's smile returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. Small world, isn't it? Ruth appeared in the doorway, looking relieved to find Sophie unharmed. Mr. Reed, the storm is picking up. Perhaps we should continue this conversation another time. Reed checked his watch and nodded. You're right, of course. I've taken enough of your evening. He handed Ruth a business card. Think about my offer, Mrs. Carter. A partnership with Reed Enterprises could secure Wildheart's future. As they walked him back to his car, the rain began to fall in earnest. Reed paused before getting in, turning to Sophie. I almost forgot we've made quite the exciting addition to our charity auction. Something I think you'll find fascinating. His smile widened. We've captured Phantom. Sophie felt the blood drain from her face. That's impossible, she said before she could stop herself. Phantom can't be caught. Reed chuckled. Every horse can be caught, Sophie, with the right methods. He got into his car, rolling down the window as the engine started. I hope you'll both attend the auction. It promises to be quite the spectacle. As the SUV pulled away, Sophie turned to Ruth, her heart pounding. He can't have caught Phantom. I saw him just last night right here in our pasture. Ruth's face was grim as she watched Reed's taillights disappear through the curtain of rain. That man is dangerous, Sophie. Stay away from him and whatever he claims to have captured. Back inside, Sophie paced the living room, while Ruth made phone calls in her bedroom, her voice too low to overhear. The storm raged outside, lightning illuminating the valley in brief, brilliant flashes. Sophie's mind whirled with everything that had happened in the past 2 days: Aurora's arrival, Foster's warnings, Reed's unsettling visit, and now the claim that Phantom had been captured. None of it made sense yet. Somehow she felt certain it was all connected. She went to her bedroom and pulled out her mother's journal again, flipping to the final pages. Reed's research. Sound as control. Sophie is the key. What had her mother discovered? What was Project Echo really about? A flash of lightning illuminated her room, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. Sophie fumbled for the flashlight she kept in her nightstand drawer. As the beam cut through the darkness, a movement outside her window caught her attention. She approached cautiously, peering out through the rain-streaked glass. A shape darker than the night stood in the yard below a horse, its coat slick with rain eyes reflecting the beam of her flashlight. Phantom. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. The black stallion looked directly at her, unmoving, despite the storm raging around him. This was no dream, no vision. He was real, standing in her yard, seemingly waiting for something. Sophie pressed her hand against the cold glass. You're here, she whispered. You're really here. The horse continued to stare at her with those ancient, knowing eyes. In a flash of lightning, Sophie saw something hanging from his neck, a broken silver chain just visible against his dark coat. Before she could make sense of what she was seeing, Ruth's voice called from the hallway. Sophie, are you all right? Sophie turned toward her grandmother's voice, and when she looked back to the window, Phantom was gone, vanished into the storm as if he'd never been there at all. Later that night, as the storm began to subside, Sophie lay awake in bed thinking about Phantom's appearance. Had he been trying to tell her something? To show her something? She remembered the silver chain she'd glimpsed around his neck. It reminded her of something, a necklace her mother used to wear, a silver pendant with a horse's head engraved on it. Sophie sat up suddenly. The pendant. She'd seen it in the dream, Eliza clutching it along with the USB drive as she ran through the rain. Quietly, Sophie slipped out of bed and padded down the hall to Ruth's room. Her grandmother was sleeping soundly, exhausted from the day's events. Sophie carefully opened the old cedar chest at the foot of Ruth's bed, where she kept Eliza's personal belongings. There, wrapped in tissue paper, was a silver chain, broken, missing its pendant. Sophie lifted it carefully, turning it over in her hands. The clasp was intact, but the chain itself had been snapped as if torn from someone's neck. This was what she'd seen on Phantom. But how, unless her mother had placed it there? Unless her recurring dream wasn't just a dream, but a memory, Phantom helping Eliza escape from Reed and his men. Sophie returned to her room, the broken chain clutched in her hand. Her mother's final journal entry echoed in her mind. Sophie is the key. She looked out her window at the clearing sky, stars beginning to emerge from behind dissipating clouds. Somewhere out there, Phantom roamed free despite Reed's claims. And somehow the magnificent black horse was connected to her mother's disappearance, to Project Echo, to the strange experiments that had left their mark on Aurora. "I'll find the truth, Mom," Sophie whispered, closing her fingers around the broken chain. "I promise." In the barn, Aurora nickered softly, as if in response to Sophie's unspoken determination. And across the valley, a black stallion raised his head to the night sky, the silver pendant at his throat catching the moonlight as he called out a sound that carried on the wind like a promise, like a warning, like a call to action. The Reed estate sprawled across 50 acres of prime Shadow Creek land, a modernist mansion of glass and stone, rising from manicured grounds like a fortress. Luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway, disgorging guests in formal attire. Security personnel in dark suits maintained a watchful presence at every entrance. Sophie crouched behind a catering van, tugging nervously at the black uniform she'd borrowed from the kitchen staff's changing area. The badge clipped to her chest identified her as Sarah, a name she'd chosen from a roster pinned to the employee bulletin board. Her heart hammered so loudly she feared someone might hear it across the courtyard. "This is crazy," she whispered to herself, clutching the small pouch of dried herbs Ruth had shown her how to mix for emergency asthma relief. Completely insane. The past week had been a blur of preparations and discoveries. Reed's charity auction and concert had become the talk of Shadow Creek, with rumors swirling about the mysterious black stallion he claimed to have captured. Sophie had listened carefully to the gossip at school, gathering information about the event's layout and security. Meanwhile, Aurora had settled into life at Wildheart, forming an unbreakable bond with Sophie. The golden filly refused to let anyone else near her. Not even Ruth could approach without causing distress. Only in Sophie's presence did Aurora seem truly at peace. Dr. Foster had visited twice more, examining Aurora's healing wound and studying the strange device he'd removed from her neck. "It's unlike anything I've seen before," he'd told Sophie. "Some kind of advanced biomonitoring system, far beyond standard tracking technology." Now watching servers hustle platters of hors d'oeuvres into Reed's mansion, Sophie took a deep breath to steady her nerves. She needed to get inside to see for herself if Reed truly had captured Phantom, and if so, to find a way to free him. Ruth would be furious if she knew what Sophie was doing. Her grandmother had explicitly forbidden her from attending the auction in any capacity. "That man is dangerous," Ruth had warned. "Promise me you'll stay away from him, Sophie." She'd promised, and now here she was, about to break that promise in the most spectacular way possible. A catering supervisor emerged from the kitchen entrance, scanning the area with a harried expression. "You new girl," she called, gesturing impatiently at Sophie. "Stop daydreaming and grab those champagne flutes." Sophie jumped to attention, hurrying to pick up the tray of glasses. Her hands trembled slightly, causing the crystal to clink together. "Careful with those," the supervisor hissed. "They cost more than you make in a month. Now get in there, the auction preview starts in 20 minutes. Hard in her throat, Sophie followed the woman through the service entrance and into the bustling kitchen. The chaos inside worked to her advantage, allowing her to blend in with the dozens of staff preparing for the evening's festivities. She shadowed another server into the main hall, a cavernous space transformed for the auction. A temporary stage dominated one end, with rows of plush seating arranged before it. Behind the stage, a massive screen displayed the Reed Ecological Enterprises logo, a stylized R, encircled by a horse silhouette. Along the perimeter, display areas had been set up, each showcasing items to be auctioned: artwork, vacation packages, jewelry, and most prominently, photos of wild horses with descriptions of their lineage and traits. Sophie set down her tray on a service table and moved through the room, keeping her head down as she pretended to straighten napkins and adjust place settings. The real prizes, the horses themselves, would be in the stables behind the main house. She needed to find a way outside without drawing attention. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice behind her sent a jolt of fear through Sophie's body. She turned slowly, expecting to face security, only to find herself looking at a young man in his late 20s. He was tall and lean, with dark hair and intense eyes that studied her with unsettling focus. I, I'm with the catering staff, Sophie stammered, gesturing to her uniform. The man raised an eyebrow. No, you're not. You're Sophie Morgan, Ruth Carter's granddaughter. Sophie's breath caught her chest, tightening with the familiar precursor to an asthma attack. She fumbled for her pouch of herbs, but the man reached out, gently catching her wrist. Don't be afraid, he said, his voice lowering. I'm not going to expose you. He glanced around to ensure no one was watching, then guided her to a quieter corner of the room. My name is Lucas Reed. Reed, Sophie repeated, the tightness in her chest increasing. You're Maxwell Reed's son, yes. A shadow crossed his face. But that doesn't mean we're aligned. He released her wrist, studying her with that same intense gaze. You have her eyes, you know. Your mother's. Sophie stared at him, confusion momentarily overwhelming her fear. You knew my mother. Lucas's expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty passing over his features. I'm not sure. I have these memories, but they don't fit together properly. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. Look, I don't have time to explain, but you need to be careful here tonight, especially with the sounds. What sounds? The frequencies they'll be using during the concert. Lucas leaned closer, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise. They're not what my father claims they are. They do something to the mind, reorganize thoughts, reshape memories. He turned his head slightly, brushing back his hair to reveal a thin scar behind his right ear, identical to the one Sophie had seen on Aurora. Like the one on Aurora, Sophie whispered. Lucas's eyes widened. You've seen it before? The marking? A filly with a golden coat. She has the same scar, and she had a device implanted in her neck. Lucas glanced nervously over his shoulder. Listen to me, Sophie. You need to... Lucas. A sharp voice cut through their conversation. There you are. Maxwell Reed approached his smile, not reaching his eyes as he assessed the situation. Making friends with the staff. Just giving directions, Father. Lucas straightened his demeanor, shifting instantly to cool professionalism. The young lady was looking for the restroom. Reed's gaze swept over Sophie, a flicker of recognition in his eyes quickly masked. Third door on the left down that hallway, he said, pointing. And then I suggest you return to your duties. The guests will be arriving shortly. Sophie nodded, keeping her head down as she hurried in the direction Reed had indicated. Behind her, she could hear him questioning Lucas in low, urgent tones. The hallway was empty, lined with closed doors. Instead of finding the restroom, Sophie tried each handle, looking for a way to the back of the property. The third door opened into a small office, its walls covered with maps and diagrams. Sophie slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. The room was clearly a workspace with technical equipment humming softly on various surfaces. A large monitor displayed what appeared to be weather patterns over Shadow Creek Valley, with animated swirls of color representing atmospheric conditions. Another screen showed a complex waveform pattern lines pulsing in rhythmic sequences. Sophie moved to the desk where folders were stacked neatly beside a laptop. The top folder was labeled Project Echo Phase 3 Implementation. Her heart skipped a beat. This was the project her mother had mentioned in her final journal entry. With trembling fingers, Sophie opened the folder. Inside were documents filled with technical jargon beyond her understanding, but certain phrases jumped out. Frequency calibration, memory reformation, behavioral synchronization, and most disturbingly, mass implementation test. A map caught her attention. Shadow Creek Valley, with concentric circles radiating outward from Reed's estate. Handwritten notes in the margins indicated sound wave coverage projections, with the town square marked as optimal saturation point. Sophie's breath quickened as the pieces began to fall into place. The charity concert, the strange devices, the talk of special acoustic technology to revitalize the valley, it was all part of something more sinister. Her gaze fell on a photograph, paper clipped to one of the documents, a laboratory setting with horses in specialized containment stalls, electrodes attached to their heads. In the foreground, partly obscured, was a golden filly that looked remarkably like Aurora. The sound of approaching voices snapped Sophie back to awareness. She quickly closed the folder and looked for a place to hide. A door at the back of the office offered the only escape. She turned the handle, relieved to find it unlocked, and slipped through just as the main door began to open. Sophie found herself in a dimly lit corridor that appeared to be a service passage. Following her instincts, she moved away from the voices, navigating the narrow hallway until she reached an exit door that opened onto the rear grounds. The evening air was cool against her flushed skin as Sophie emerged behind the mansion. Ahead lay expansive gardens, and beyond them, the glow of lights from what must be the stables. She could hear the soft nickering of horses drawing her forward like a beacon. Security was lighter here, with most personnel focused on the arriving guests at the front of the property. Sophie moved from shadow to shadow, making her way toward the stables. As she drew closer, she could hear voices, men discussing final preparations for the auction. "Is the special lot secured?" someone asked. "Double-check the restraints myself," another replied. "That devil nearly took my hand off earlier. Had to sedate him again. Reed wants him on full display by 9. Says he'll personally demonstrate the training technique." "Training technique?" the second voice scoffed. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Their laughter faded as they moved away, leaving Sophie with a cold knot of dread in her stomach. She waited until the coast was clear, then slipped into the stable through a side door. The building was state-of-the-art with climate control and individual stalls larger than some apartments. Each contained a horse, most standing quietly, likely sedated. These were the wild horses captured for auction, their spirits temporarily subdued by chemicals and confinement. Sophie moved down the center aisle, searching for any sign of phantom. At the far end, she found a separate section cordoned off from the rest, with additional security measures, a keypad lock on the stall door, and a surveillance camera mounted overhead. Standing on tiptoe, Sophie peered through the small observation window. Inside was a magnificent black stallion, larger than any horse she'd ever seen. His coat gleamed under the stable lights, muscles rippling beneath the surface as he pawed restlessly at the ground. But something wasn't right. Sophie studied the horse carefully, noting the white star on his forehead, the shape of his ears, the proportion of his body. "You're not Phantom," she whispered. The black stallion turned toward her, voice eyes reflecting the light. "Beautiful, yes, and wild, certainly, but not the horse from her dreams, not the one she'd seen in the north pasture, with ancient wisdom in his gaze." Reed was lying. This was simply another wild stallion, impressive but ordinary. Where was the real Phantom then, and why the elaborate deception? A door banged open at the far end of the stable. Sophie ducked into an empty stall, crouching in the shadows as footsteps approached. "The acoustics in the concert hall have been fine-tuned," a voice said, Reed's voice unmistakable in its cultured precision. "The frequency distribution will cover the entire audience with particular concentration on the town officials' seating section." "And the behavioral triggers," another man asked, "embedded in the music, subtle enough to pass as artistic flourishes, potent enough to create the desired effect." Reed's voice grew closer. "By tomorrow morning, every influential person in Shadow Creek will be aligned with our development plans. The town council will approve the water rights transfer without question. And the memory alterations, limited for now, just enough to create a sense that the decision was their own idea, reached through logical consideration rather than external influence." The footsteps stopped near Sophie's hiding place. Through a gap in the stall door, she could see Reed standing with an older man in a lab coat studying a tablet display. "Impressive results from the equine trials," the other man commented. "Subject E9 showed complete behavioral reformation after just 3 sessions." "E9, Reed mused. "Our golden girl. Speaking of which, any progress locating her?" "None. The tracking device went offline last week somewhere near the old Carter property. We've searched the area, but there's no sign of her." Reed frowned. "That's concerning. E9 represents our most successful integration of the technology. I want her found." He glanced at his watch. "The guests will be seated by now. Let's proceed with the demonstration." As they moved toward the special stall, Sophie's foot knocked against a bucket, sending it rolling across the floor. The sound echoed in the quiet stable. Reed and his companion froze. "Security check," Reed called out sharply. Sophie pressed herself into the darkest corner of the stall, heart pounding. Her chest tightened, the familiar wheeze of an asthma attack building in her lungs. She fumbled for her pouch of herbs, managing to place some under her tongue just as the stall door swung open. A security guard stood there, flashlight beam sweeping the space. Sophie held her breath, willing herself to become invisible. The light passed over her once, then returned, fixing on her huddled form. "Sir," the guard called. "There's someone here." "Sure, Mum." Reed appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting from annoyance to calculated interest as he recognized Sophie. "Well, well, Sophie Morgan. This is a surprise." Rough hands pulled her to her feet and out of the stall. Sophie struggled to breathe the herbal remedy, only partially effective against the stress-induced attack. "Bring her to my office," Reed instructed, "and find Dr. Hammond. Tell him we have a situation." "Leave her alone." The voice came from behind them. Lucas standing in the stable doorway, his face tight with anger. "She's just a kid, Father." Reed turned to his son, expression cooling. "A kid who's trespassing on private property, spying on a private event. That raises certain questions, doesn't it?" He studied Lucas with narrowed eyes. "How did you know she was here?" "I saw her on the security feed." Lucas moved closer, his gaze fixed on Sophie's distressed face. "She's having an asthma attack. She needs medical attention, not an interrogation." "Ah, how fortunate that Dr. Hammond is on his way," Reed replied smoothly. "He can attend to her medical needs while we discuss her unexpected visit." He nodded to the guard. "Take her to the house. Lucas, come with me. We need to talk." Sophie was half led, half carried back to the mansion, each breath a struggle. Through her haze of fear and oxygen deprivation, one thought burned clear: Reed was planning to use the concert to somehow control the minds of everyone in Shadow Creek. And she was the only one who knew. The thundering of hooves echoed through the forest as a dozen wild horses galloped through the darkness, their breath misting in the cool night air. At their head ran Phantom, his powerful stride eating up the distance between Reed's estate and the Wild Heart Rehabilitation Center. Ruth Carter stood on the porch watching their approach with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Beside her, Joseph Whitecloud leaned on his walking stick, his weathered face impassive in the moonlight. "It has begun," the elder said softly. "The calling." The horses slowed as they reached the property boundary, Phantom continuing forward alone until he stood before the porch steps. His intelligent eyes fixed on Ruth, an unmistakable urgency in his stance. "She went to Reed's auction, didn't she?" Ruth asked, her voice tight with worry. "Sophie's in trouble." Whitecloud placed a gnarled hand on Ruth's shoulder. "The girl follows her mother's path, as it should be." Ruth's face hardened. "Last time someone followed that path, I lost my daughter." She turned to the elder. "We need to call Foster, now." Inside the barn, Aurora paced her stall restlessly, whinnying in distress. The Golden Filly's agitation had begun hours earlier, coinciding with Sophie's departure. Now she threw herself against the stall door, her cries growing more frantic. "She feels it too," Whitecloud observed as they entered the barn. "The connection." Ruth crossed to Aurora's stall, speaking in low, soothing tones. The filly calmed slightly at her voice but continued to watch the door anxiously. "I thought we had more time," Ruth murmured, more to herself than to Whitecloud. "I thought she'd be older before." "The choosing does not wait for our convenience," the elder replied. "The spirits move as they must." He approached Aurora's stall, studying the golden filly with knowing eyes. "This one carries the ancient bloodline, as does the dark one outside." "And Sophie?" Ruth asked, her voice barely audible. "What does she carry?" Whitecloud's expression softened. "The same gift her mother had, the same burden." He touched the turquoise pendant hanging at his throat. "Our people have known of such bonds for centuries. What your family calls echo frequencies, we named spirit voices long ago. The ability to hear what cannot be heard, to bridge the divide between human and animal consciousness. A gift that got my daughter killed," Ruth said bitterly. "Perhaps." Whitecloud looked toward the open barn door, where Phantom waited like a sentinel. "Or perhaps not." Ruth's phone rang, breaking the moment. She answered quickly, her face paling as she listened. "How long ago?" she demanded. "And you're certain it was her?" A pause. "We'll be right there." She ended the call, already moving toward the door. "That was Foster. He's at Reed's auction, monitoring the situation. Sophie's been caught, Reed has her." Outside, Phantom's head jerked up at her words, a sound somewhere between a whinny and a roar tearing from his throat. Behind him, the wild herd answered their calls, rising into the night like a battle cry. It seems we are not the only ones planning a rescue. White Cloud observed a glimmer of appreciation in his eyes. The wild call has been sounded. Sophie sat in Reed's plush office, breathing easier now, thanks to the inhaler provided by Dr. Hammond, a thin, nervous man who had examined her with clinical detachment before declaring her stable enough for questioning. Reed stood by the window watching the guests arrive for the auction. Lucas leaned against the wall, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert, missing nothing. Two security guards flanked the door, ensuring Sophie had no chance of escape. "You know, Sophie," Reed began conversationally, "your mother and I worked closely together for several years. Brilliant woman, visionary in many ways." He turned to face her. But she suffered from a tendency to overreact, to see sinister motives where none existed. Sophie remained silent, unwilling to engage. She had decided her best strategy was to play dumb, a frightened child who had sneaked into the auction on a whim, nothing more. "I'm curious," Reed continued. "What exactly brought you here tonight? A desire to see the famous phantom, or perhaps something more specific?" His gaze hardened. "Something in my private office, for instance." Sophie's stomach clenched. He knew she'd been in there. But how much had she seen? How much did he think she understood? "I just wanted to see the horses," she said, her voice small. "Everyone at school was talking about the auction, about Phantom." Reed studied her clearly, weighing her response. A natural curiosity, understandable. He moved to his desk, pressing a button on an intercom. "Please inform the guests that the preview will begin in 15 minutes. And prepare our special demonstration." He released the button, smiling at Sophie. "Since you're so interested in the horses, perhaps you'd like a front row seat for tonight's main event? A private viewing before the general audience is admitted." "Father," Lucas interjected, straightening from the wall, "I don't think that's appropriate. She should be taken home." "Nonsense." Reed waved away his son's concern. "It's an educational opportunity. Dr. Hammond will accompany us to ensure her health isn't compromised." He fixed Sophie with a penetrating stare. "I think young Sophie will find our demonstration quite illuminating." Something in his tone sent a chill down Sophie's spine. This wasn't kindness, it was calculation. Reed wanted her to see something specific, but why they moved as a group through the mansion's corridors, emerging into the auction hall, where staff were making final adjustments to the seating and displays. At the far end, a section had been curtained off, hiding something from view. Reed led them to a small cluster of seats in the front row. "The best view in the house," he said, gesturing for Sophie to sit. Lucas took the seat beside her, his presence oddly reassuring despite his connection to Reed. "What you're about to witness," Reed announced, standing before them like a ringmaster, "is the culmination of years of research into acoustic behavioral modification, a humane, non-invasive method of communicating with wild horses at their deepest neurological level." He nodded to an assistant who drew back the curtain to reveal a specialized containment area. Inside stood the black stallion Sophie had seen in the stable, the false phantom now fitted with what appeared to be a lightweight headset around his ears. "This magnificent specimen has resisted all traditional training methods," Reed continued. "Aggressive, unpredictable, dangerous to himself and others. The perfect candidate for our demonstration." He approached a control panel, adjusting settings as he spoke. "The technology is quite simple in concept. Specific sound frequencies resonate with neural pathways, creating a state of heightened receptivity. The mind becomes, shall we say, more open to suggestion." Sophie watched in growing horror as Reed activated the system. A soft, barely audible hum filled the air. The black stallion, previously agitated and defensive, suddenly went still, his eyes glazing over slightly. "Observe," Reed said, approaching the containment area. He entered a code on a keypad, opening a gate between himself and the horse. In his hand was a small device like a remote control. Complete docility achieved without drugs, without force. The stallion stood motionless as Reed approached, not reacting even when the man placed a hand on his muscular neck. Reed pressed a button on his device, and the horse knelt down on command, then stood again, then walked in a perfect circle. "Remarkable," Dr. Hammond murmured from behind them. "The response time continues to improve." "And the duration?" Lucas asked, his voice carefully neutral. Up to 12 hours with a single application, Reed replied. Longer with repeated exposure. He turned to Sophie with a triumphant smile. Imagine the applications. Wild horses domesticated without trauma. No more dangerous braking processes. No more injured animals or trainers. Sophie found her voice at last. It's not natural, she said. You're not communicating with him. You're controlling him. Reed's smile never faltered. A semantic distinction, my dear. Is it control when we use a bridle? When we build a fence, humans have been guiding animal behavior since the dawn of civilization. He returned to the control panel, adjusting another setting. The difference is merely one of methodology. The hum in the air changed subtly, taking on a pulsing quality. Sophie felt a strange pressure in her head, a momentary disorientation that passed as quickly as it came. Beside her, Lucas stiffened his hand, going to the scar behind his ear. You feel it, don't you? Reed said, watching them both carefully. Just at the edge of perception. The human brain is remarkably similar to the equine brain in certain fundamental ways. Both respond to the same harmonic principles. Sophie's thoughts became slightly fuzzy, a feeling like being underwater pressing against her consciousness. You're using it on people, she said, the words coming slowly. That's what the concert is for. Reed's expression shifted, reassessment in his eyes. Clever girl, just like your mother. He increased a setting on the panel, and the pressure in Sophie's head intensified. Yes, the principles can be adapted for human application. Subtle influence rather than direct control, encouraging certain thought patterns, discouraging others. Mind control. Sophie managed fighting against the growing fog in her brain. Behavioral guidance, Reed corrected. Tonight's concert will feature specially composed music embedded with particular frequency patterns. Nothing harmful, just a gentle nudge toward supporting our valley revitalization plan. A community united in purpose. The room seemed to tilt slightly as Sophie struggled to maintain her focus. Beside her, Lucas had gone rigid, his breathing, shallow eyes fixed on some middle distance. Stop it, Sophie gasped. You're hurting him. Reed glanced at his son with clinical interest. An expected reaction. The implant is responding to the calibration signal. He reduced the setting slightly. Better. Lucas slumped in his seat, color returning to his face as he drew a shuddering breath. You promised no more tests, he said, voice raw with betrayal. This isn't a test, son. It's a demonstration. Reed turned his attention back to Sophie. Your mother discovered this technology's potential quite by accident, you know. Her research into how wild horses communicate across vast distances led her to identify certain subaudible frequencies that carry emotional and behavioral information. He moved closer, studying Sophie's reaction. What she failed to appreciate was the broader application. She wanted to use it to communicate with horses. I saw the opportunity to help humanity communicate with itself on a deeper level. She knew exactly what you were doing, Sophie said, finding strength in her anger. She was trying to stop you. Something dangerous flashed in Reed's eyes. Yes, she was quite determined in that regard. Unwisely so. He checked his watch. The guests will be arriving in the auction hall soon. Dr. Hammond, please escort Miss Morgan to the secure room. Ensure she's comfortable. She'll be joining us for the concert portion of the evening. And if she refuses? Lucas asked, still recovering from whatever the sound had triggered in him. Reed smiled thinly. I don't think that will be an issue. The preview frequency has already established the necessary neural pathways. By concert time, she'll be quite eager to attend. As Dr. Hammond approached, Sophie felt a surge of desperate clarity. Whatever Reed had done to her with that sound, whatever he planned to do to the entire town, she had to stop it. She had to escape. Her gaze fell on the silver chain around her neck, her mother's broken necklace, which she'd taken to wearing since finding it. The pendant was missing, but the chain itself still felt like a connection to Eliza. Sophie clutched it tightly, focusing on that link, pushing back against the fog in her mind. An image flashed through her thoughts. Phantom running through the night, Ruth and White Cloud following in Ruth's old truck, Foster's car ahead of them. They were coming. Somehow she knew this with absolute certainty. Dr. Hammond's hand closed around her arm, pulling her to her feet. This way, young lady. Sophie allowed herself to be led toward the exit, mind racing behind her deliberately blank expression. She needed time, needed a plan. Behind her, she could hear Reed giving Lucas instructions for the evening, his tone leaving no room for argument. As they passed through a service corridor, a commotion erupted somewhere in the front of the mansion, raised voices running footsteps. Dr. Hammond paused, listening intently. "Security breach," someone shouted from a distance. "North perimeter." The doctor's grip on Sophie's arm tightened. "Keep moving," he ordered, suddenly nervous. They rounded a corner and came face to face with Nathan Foster, his normally kind face set in hard lines. Before Hammond could react, Foster's fist connected with the doctor's jaw, sending him crumpling to the floor. "Sophie," Foster said urgently, checking her over. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, relief flooding through her. "Dr. Foster, how did you—" "No time," he cut her off, already leading her toward a side exit. "Ruth and White Cloud are creating a diversion at the front gate. We need to move before Reed realizes what's happening." They hurried through the mansion's winding service passages, Foster navigating with surprising familiarity. "I worked here briefly," he explained, seeing her questioning look, "before I understood what Reed was really doing." "He's going to use the concert to control everyone's minds," Sophie blurted out. "Some kind of sound technology that affects neural pathways. I saw it work on a horse and on Lucas." Foster's expression darkened. "I know. It's what your mother was trying to expose 3 years ago." He pushed open a door that led to the gardens behind the mansion. "That's why she had to disappear." Sophie stumbled, nearly falling. "Disappear, not die." Foster froze, realizing what he'd revealed. "Sophie, my mother's alive." The world seemed to tilt beneath Sophie's feet. "All this time she's been alive." A shout from behind them cut off Foster's response. "There by the east exit." "Run!" Foster urged, pushing her ahead of him. "Head for the trees. Ruth will meet us at the rendezvous point." Sophie ran, legs pumping, lungs burning, as she sprinted across the open ground toward the forest edge. Foster kept pace beside her, glancing back at their pursuers. The sound of hoofbeats approached from their right, security on horseback closing fast. They reached the tree line, plunging into the dense undergrowth. The forest was dark branches scratching at Sophie's face and arms as she pushed forward. Her breathing grew labored, the exertion triggering her asthma once more. "I can't," she gasped, stumbling to a halt. "Need my inhaler." Foster steadied her, reaching into his pocket. "I brought a spare. Ruth told me you might need it." The medication helped, but Sophie still struggled to catch her breath. The sounds of pursuit were growing closer, flashlight beams cutting through the trees behind them, voices calling to each other as they coordinated the search. "We need to keep moving," Foster urged. "Just a little farther." They pressed on, Sophie fighting against her body's limitations. The forest floor began to slope upward, the terrain becoming rockier. Foster led them toward what appeared to be a sheer cliff face, disappearing suddenly around an outcropping. "In here," he called softly. Sophie followed, finding herself in the mouth of a cave, hidden by overhanging vegetation. Foster guided her deeper inside, where the darkness was absolute. "Stay close," he whispered. "There's a passage that leads through the mountain. It comes out near Shadow Creek's north ridge." "How do you know about this place?" Sophie asked, voice hushed. "Your mother showed me." Foster's voice held a complex mixture of emotions. It was part of her escape route if things went wrong at Reed's facility. They moved carefully through the darkness, Foster using a small penlight to illuminate their path. The cave narrowed into a natural tunnel, winding its way through the mountain's heart. Water dripped from the ceiling, the sound echoing in the confined space. "Dr. Foster," Sophie began hesitantly, "is my mother really alive?" A long silence followed, broken only by their footsteps on the rocky ground. Finally, Foster sighed. "Yes, she had to make everyone believe she died in that accident. It was the only way to protect you and Ruth while she gathered evidence against Reed. But why didn't she come back? It's been 3 years." Sophie's voice cracked with emotion. "Reed is powerful, Sophie. He has connections in government and law enforcement. Your mother needed irrefutable proof of what he was doing, proof that couldn't be dismissed or covered up." Foster paused, helping Sophie over a particularly difficult section of path. "And she needed to ensure the technology couldn't be replicated if Reed was stopped." "The USB drive," Sophie realized. "In my dream, her memory, she had a USB drive and her pendant." "Yes." The drive contains all her research, including how to counteract the echo frequencies. The pendant, Foster hesitated. The pendant is something more, a key of sorts. They had reached a section of the tunnel where the ceiling rose dramatically, creating a cathedral-like chamber. Foster's penlight revealed ancient pictographs on the walls, horses running beneath stylized sound waves, human figures with their hands raised in what appeared to be communication. Your family's connection to horses goes back further than you know, Foster said softly, gesturing to the images. This cave was sacred to the indigenous people of this valley. White Cloud's ancestors. They recognized the special bond that certain individuals could form with horses, a bond that transcended normal communication. Sophie stared at the paintings, recognition stirring within her. The song Ruth was singing, the one she said all the women in our family know. A melody that resonates at exactly the frequency needed to establish that bond, Foster confirmed. Your mother discovered that the same frequency could disrupt Reed's control technology, cancel it out completely. That's why he wants Aurora, Sophie said, pieces falling into place. She's immune somehow. The device in her neck wasn't working properly. Exactly. Some horses, particularly those from ancient bloodlines, have a natural resistance to the technology. Phantom is one. Aurora, his daughter, is another. Foster's voice took on an urgent quality. Reed has been breeding and experimenting on these horses, trying to overcome their resistance to understand the mechanism behind it. They continued through the cave system, the path beginning to slope upward again. A faint glow ahead suggested they were nearing an exit. So my mother has been in hiding all this time, gathering evidence, Sophie said, still processing this revelation. Does Ruth know? Has she been in contact with her? Foster's hesitation told Sophie everything. Ruth has always known, she said, hurt blooming in her chest. She's been lying to me for 3 years. To protect you, Foster insisted. The less you knew, the safer you were. Reed has been watching you both, waiting for any sign of contact with Eliza. They emerged from the cave onto a rocky ledge overlooking Shadow Creek Valley. In the distance, the lights of Reed's estate blazed against the darkening sky. Closer, the town itself nestled in the valley floor, unsuspecting of the mental manipulation planned for the evening. Where do we go now? Sophie asked, the enormity of their situation settling over her. Before Foster could answer, a soft nickering came from the trees to their left. Phantom stepped into view, his dark coat gleaming in the fading light. Behind him, Aurora emerged, her golden coat like a beacon in the gathering dusk. They found us, Sophie breathed, moving toward the horses with instinctive trust. Foster hung back, watching in amazement as both horses approached Sophie without hesitation. Phantom lowered his head, and Sophie saw what she had glimpsed in the storm, her mother's silver pendant hanging from a leather cord around his powerful neck. With trembling fingers, Sophie reached for the pendant. As her hand closed around the cool metal, a flood of images rushed through her mind. Her mother in a hidden cabin, surrounded by equipment working feverishly on something. Reed's laboratory with horses in specialized stalls. A woman watching from a distance, her face partially obscured, but achingly familiar. She's close, Sophie whispered, the certainty filling her like a physical presence. She's been watching over us all along. As if in response, thunder rumbled in the distance. Sophie looked up to see storm clouds gathering with unnatural speed centered over Reed's estate. A cold wind began to blow, carrying the scent of rain. Weather manipulation technology, Foster said grimly. Another of Reed's innovations. He's creating a storm to drive everyone inside for the concert. Aurora nudged Sophie's shoulder, her intelligent eyes fixed on the girl's face. Again, that strange connection flickered between them. Images, emotions, knowledge not her own flowing into Sophie's consciousness. I know where to go, Sophie said suddenly. Phantom will show us the way. Foster looked skeptical but nodded. Lead on then. Sophie approached Phantom, who knelt in a smooth motion, allowing her to climb onto his bare back. Aurora moved to Foster, not permitting him to mount, but clearly indicating he should follow. The veterinarian nodded in understanding, prepared to go on foot. Reed has Ruth and White Cloud, Sophie said as Phantom rose beneath her. They were captured at the front gate. We need to stop the concert and rescue them before Reed activates the sound system. How do you know that? Foster asked, startled. Sophie touched the pendant at her throat, the connection to her mother, stronger than ever. I just do. Phantom turned without guidance, beginning to pick his way down the ridge toward a path only he seemed to know. Aurora followed with Foster, jogging to keep up. The first drops of rain began to fall as they descended, the artificial storm gathering strength with each passing minute. As they moved through the darkening forest, Sophie felt her asthma threatening again, the combination of stress and exertion taking its toll. She focused on her breathing, on the steady rhythm of Phantom's movement beneath her. The pendant seemed to grow warm against her skin, its presence somehow stabilizing. We need to hurry, Foster called from behind. The concert is scheduled to start at 9. It's nearly 8:30 now. Phantom increased his pace in response, as if understanding the urgency. They emerged from the forest onto a ridge overlooking Reed's estate from the opposite side. From this vantage point, Sophie could see guests being ushered into the mansion as the rain intensified, security personnel closing exterior gates and taking up positions around the perimeter. We'll never get past security, Foster said, coming up beside Sophie. Not through any conventional entrance. Aurora nickered softly, drawing their attention to a service road that wound around the back of the property, ending at what appeared to be a maintenance entrance. A single guard stood watch, looking miserable in the increasing downpour. That might work, Foster admitted, but we'd need a distraction. As if in response to his words, Phantom raised his head and let out a powerful call, a sound that echoed across the valley like a trumpet blast. From multiple directions came answering calls, and within moments, wild horses began to emerge from the forest around them, dozens of them moving as a coordinated herd. My God, Foster breathed. He's calling them, summoning them. Sophie felt something shift within her, a connection deepening. The pendant pulsed warmly against her skin as the melody Ruth had sung rose to her lips, unbidden. She began to hum it softly then, with more confidence, the notes seeming to resonate with something in the air around them. Phantom's call changed, becoming more rhythmic, almost musical in its cadence. The assembled horses responded, their voices joining in a haunting chorus that seemed to vibrate through Sophie's very bones. The echo, Foster whispered in awe. The true echo, not Reed's corruption of it, but the original connection. The wild call. The storm above them intensified, lightning cracking across the sky. But now Sophie could sense something else in the atmospheric disturbance. A presence, a consciousness directing the natural energy against Reed's artificial manipulation. She's using his own technology against him, Sophie realized, turning the storm back on itself. Foster stared at her. Who is? Sophie met his gaze, certainty filling her. My mother. She's here. She's been here all along. In the distance, a lone rider appeared on the ridge opposite them, a woman on a chestnut horse silhouetted against the stormy sky. Even at this distance, Sophie knew her immediately, the recognition burning through her like fire. Mom, she whispered, tears mixing with the rain on her face. For a moment, the figure seemed to look directly at Sophie, raising a hand in acknowledgement. Then horse and rider turned, disappearing back into the forest as lightning illuminated the valley once more. Sophie straightened on Phantom's back, a new determination flooding through her. The wild horses around them stirred restlessly, awaiting direction. We have to go back, she said to Foster. Back to Reed's mansion. We have to stop the concert. It's too dangerous, Foster argued. We should regroup, come up with a plan. There's no time. Sophie clutched the pendant, drawing strength from its connection to her mother. Reed is about to control the minds of everyone in Shadow Creek. And Lucas, he has some kind of implant. Who knows what Reed might do to him if the plan succeeds? Foster hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. What's your plan? Sophie turned to the assembled wild horses, feeling the connection between them like a tangible force. We're going to use Reed's storm against him, and we're going to use the true echo to disrupt his technology. She looked down at Foster, a confidence beyond her years in her eyes. But first we need to get inside that mansion. Phantom pawed the ground beneath her, ready. Aurora moved to Sophie's side, her golden coat gleaming despite the rain. Around them, the wild herd shifted, organized, awaiting the command. In the valley below, Reed's mansion glowed like a beacon in the artificial storm, unsuspecting of the true wild call that was about to answer. I've completed part 2, 6,000 words of the wild call following your outline. This section develops the plot as Sophie infiltrates Reed's auction, discovers the truth about Project. Echo learns her mother may still be alive and escapes with Dr. Foster. It introduces new dimensions to the characters, particularly Lucas Reed, with his mysterious implant, and builds toward the upcoming confrontation. The storm transformed the valley into a world of shadow and fury. Rain lashed down in sheets, turning the manicured grounds of Reed's estate into muddy streams. Lightning fractured the sky in brilliant flashes, followed by thunder that shook the earth beneath their feet. Sophie crouched behind the service entrance, soaked to the skin and shivering. Foster knelt beside her, his face grim in the stormy half-light. They had left Phantom and Aurora hidden in the trees with the wild herd ready to respond when called. "Remember," Foster said, raising his voice above the storm's howl, "our priority is disabling the sound system before Reed can activate it. Once the frequency begins broadcasting, it may be too late." Sophie nodded, clutching her mother's pendant. Since touching it, the connection had grown stronger, images and knowledge flowing into her mind that she couldn't possibly have known otherwise. She understood now what Reed was planning and why her mother had risked everything to stop him. "The control booth is behind the main concert hall," she said with certainty. "There's a secondary system in Reed's office as backup." Foster gave her a questioning look. "How do you—" "Mom is showing me," Sophie replied, simply tapping the pendant. "Somehow she's connected to this. To me." Before Foster could respond, their opportunity arrived. A maintenance worker emerged from the service door, shaking rain from his jacket. Foster moved swiftly, approaching the man with an authoritative stride. "Engineering sent me to check the backup generators." He called over the storm's noise, flashing what appeared to be an ID badge. "This storm's causing power fluctuations in the East Wing." The worker squinted at the badge, then at Foster's face. Recognition flickered in his eyes. "Dr. Foster, I thought you left the company years ago." Foster's expression never faltered. "Special consultant, Reed called me back for tonight's demonstration." He gestured to Sophie. "My assistant. We need to move quickly before the power drops again." The man hesitated, uncertainty crossing his face. Sophie felt her chest tightening with anxiety, the familiar wheeze building in her lungs. "Not now," she thought desperately. "Not when we're so close." A massive thunderclap shook the building, and at that exact moment the lights flickered. The worker glanced nervously at the sky, then back at Foster. "Fine," he said, stepping aside. "But stick to the service corridors. All personnel are supposed to be out of sight during the concert." They slipped inside Sophie, breathing a sigh of relief as the door closed behind them. The service corridor was narrow and utilitarian, a stark contrast to the opulent public spaces of the mansion. They moved quickly, following the route that somehow appeared in Sophie's mind like a map unfolding. "Left here," she whispered as they approached an intersection. "Then 2 rights past the kitchen." Foster followed her lead without question, though his expression betrayed his bewilderment at her newfound knowledge. They passed busy staff preparing for the reception that would follow the concert, heads down, moving with purpose to avoid attracting attention. As they neared the main hall, the sounds of an orchestra warming up reached them, strings tuning woodwinds, running scales. The concert was about to begin. "We need to hurry," Foster urged. Sophie nodded, leading them down another corridor. Through a small window in a service door, she could see the concert hall filling with Shadow Creek's residents. The mayor and town council in the front row, business owners and influential citizens arranged behind them, regular townsfolk filling the remaining seats. On stage, a full orchestra was arranged before a sophisticated sound system. Technicians made final adjustments to equipment that looked far more complex than necessary for a simple charity concert. "There," Sophie whispered, pointing to a glassed-in booth at the back of the hall. "That's the control center." Inside the booth, Reed stood with Dr. Hammond and several technicians overlooking banks of specialized equipment. Reed's expression was one of barely contained triumph as he surveyed the assembled audience. "How do we get in there?" Foster asked. "It's completely exposed." Sophie scanned the area, her gaze landing on a small door to the left of the booth. "Service access," she said. "For the sound system wiring. We can come up behind them." They backtracked, finding another corridor that led toward their target. As they moved, Sophie felt her connection to the pendant growing stronger. Images flashed through her mind, circuit boards, frequency modulators, the specific equipment Reed was using. I know how to disable it, she realized aloud. Mom is showing me the override sequence. Foster stared at her in amazement. Sophie, how is this possible? How can Eliza be communicating with you through a pendant? The same way I can sense Aurora's feelings, Sophie replied. The same way Phantom called the wild herd. It's what Mom was researching, the true echo. Not control, but connection. They reached the service access door, finding it locked with an electronic keypad. Foster cursed under his breath. We need a code. Sophie closed her eyes, focusing on the pendant. Numbers appeared in her mind, 52739. Try 52739, she said. Foster entered the sequence, his eyebrows rising in surprise as the lock clicked open. Eliza's birthday, he murmured. Reed always used it as a base for his security codes, a twisted tribute to her. They slipped through the door into a cramped space filled with cables and equipment. Ahead, through a narrow maintenance hatch, they could see the back of the control booth. Reed's voice drifted to them, clear and commanding. Initiate the primary sequence at precisely 9:15 during the third movement, he was saying. The harmonic overlay should be imperceptible to conscious awareness, but the neural effect will be immediate. And the special frequencies for the council members, Dr. Hammond asked. Channel 3 targeted to the front 3 rows. By tomorrow morning, they'll believe the water rights transfer was entirely their idea. Reed checked his watch. It's time. Begin the program. Sophie and Foster exchanged alarmed glances as the lights in the concert hall dimmed. The audience applauded as the conductor took the stage, bowing gracefully before turning to the orchestra. We have to move now, Foster whispered. Sophie nodded, but as she shifted position, a cable caught her foot. She stumbled, catching herself against the wall, but knocking over a toolbox in the process. The metallic clatter seemed deafening in the confined space. Inside the booth, Reed's head snapped toward the sound. Check that, he ordered a security guard, pointing toward the maintenance hatch. Run, Foster hissed, pushing Sophie back toward the access door. I'll hold them off. No, Sophie protested. We have to stay together. But Foster was already moving toward the hatch, positioning himself to intercept the guard. Get to the stage, he told her. Use the pendant. Disrupt the frequency. I'll find you. Sophie hesitated only a moment before turning and racing back through the access door. Behind her, she heard the sounds of a struggle as Foster confronted the security guard. She forced herself forward, mind racing, to formulate a new plan. The concert had begun, the orchestra playing what sounded like a classical piece with modern elements woven throughout. To the untrained ear, it was simply beautiful music. But Sophie could feel something else beneath the notes, a subtle pattern, a rhythm that seemed to press against her mind like fingers seeking entrance. She circled around to the side of the concert hall, finding a door that led to the wings of the stage. Stagehands and technical crew moved about, focused on their tasks. Sophie slipped past them, her small size and purposeful movement helping her avoid notice. From the wings, she could see the full orchestra, the conductor's back to her, as he led them through the first movement. The audience sat enraptured, many already showing signs of the frequency's effect, a slight glassiness to their eyes, a uniformity to their posture. Sophie scanned the crowd, spotting Ruth and White Cloud, seated in the back row, flanked by security personnel. Her grandmother's face was tight with worry, her eyes darting around the hall as if searching for something or someone. White Cloud sat in meditative stillness, his weathered face unreadable. In the front row, Lucas Reed sat rigid, his expression pained. One hand kept rising to the scar behind his ear, then dropping back to his lap as if fighting against some internal compulsion. Sophie needed to act quickly, but how she couldn't simply run onto the stage and disrupt the performance. She needed a distraction, something to break the audience's concentration and interrupt the frequency's effect. The pendant seemed to pulse against her skin, growing warmer. Sophie closed her eyes, focusing on its energy, on the connection it represented. Help me, she whispered. Show me what to do. In response, a melody rose in her mind, the same ancient song Ruth had sung, the one that had calmed Aurora and called to Phantom. But now Sophie understood its significance. The song's pattern created a counter-frequency, a disruptive wave that could cancel out Reed's controlling signal. Sophie took a deep breath, steadying herself. She would have only one chance. As the orchestra paused between movements preparing for the critical third section, where Reed would activate the primary sequence, Sophie stepped onto the stage. A murmur ran through the audience at the sight of the small girl walking calmly to center stage. The conductor turned in confusion, his baton faltering. From the control booth, Reed surged to his feet, recognition and alarm crossing his face. "Security!" he shouted, his voice carrying through the hall. But before anyone could reach her, Sophie raised the pendant before her and began to sing. The melody poured from her with surprising strength, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the hall. The pendant glowed in the stage lights, seeming to amplify her voice to give it a resonance beyond her years. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Throughout the hall, people stirred as if waking from a trance confusion, replacing the placid acceptance on their faces. The musicians faltered, instruments dropping into discord before falling silent altogether. In the control booth, alarms began to sound as equipment overloaded, frequency monitors spiking wildly. Reed rushed to the control panel, frantically attempting to override whatever was happening. "Shut her down," he shouted to his security team. "Now!" Two guards rushed the stage, but before they could reach Sophie, a commotion erupted at the main entrance. The massive doors burst open, admitting a howling gust of wind and rain, and with it, the thundering of hooves. Phantom charged into the concert hall, his powerful body gleaming wet from the storm, the wild majesty of him drawing gasps from the audience. Behind him came Aurora, golden coat, shimmering even in the artificial light. The two horses raced down the center aisle toward the stage people, scrambling from their seats to avoid being trampled. Chaos erupted as more wild horses appeared at the entrance, creating a barrier that prevented Reed's security from closing the doors. Phantom reached the stage rearing up with a trumpeting call that echoed through the hall like a battle cry. Sophie continued to sing, her voice growing stronger as Phantom and Aurora joined her on stage, flanking her protectively. The pendant's glow intensified, bathing the stage in silver light. In the back of the hall, Ruth broke free from her guards in the confusion, racing toward the stage with White Cloud close behind. From a side entrance, Foster appeared bloodied up but unbowed, making his way through the panicked crowd. Reed's voice cut through the chaos, amplified by the hall's speaker system. "This is a security situation. Everyone remain calm and exit in an orderly fashion." But his authority was crumbling. The frequency that had held the audience in its subtle grip was now disrupted, leaving them clear-headed and witnessing the extraordinary scene before them, a young girl with a glowing pendant singing an ancient melody while wild horses stood guard around her. From the stage, Sophie locked eyes with Reed, never breaking her song. The pendant's light seemed to focus on him, exposing him in its revealing glow. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. "Cut the power," he shouted to his technicians. "Shut down everything." The lights flickered, then stabilized as the building's backup generators engaged. But the sound system died, cutting off Reed's amplified commands. In the sudden audio void, Sophie's voice rang out, even more clearly, joined now by another Ruth climbing onto the stage, adding her deeper tones to the ancient melody. White Cloud followed his weathered voice, contributing a rhythmic chant that complemented the women's song. The three generations stood together, their voices weaving a counter-frequency that rippled through the hall like a cleansing wave. Reed staggered back from the control panel, clutching his head as if in pain. Beside him, Dr. Hammond collapsed unconscious. Throughout the hall, those who had been most directly exposed to the controlling frequency, the technicians, Reed's inner circle, the town officials in the front rows, seemed to be experiencing the greatest discomfort. Lucas made his way to the stage, moving with difficulty, one hand pressed to the scar behind his ear. "Sophie," he gasped, reaching her side. "It's working. The implant, it's deactivating. I can feel it." Sophie nodded without breaking her song, understanding flowing through her from the pendant. The counter-frequency was not only disrupting the mind control signal, but actively reversing its effects, breaking down the neural pathways Reed had established. Foster joined them on stage, a laptop in his hands. "I've got it," he said, his voice urgent. All the data from Reed's system, the entire Project Echo, downloaded before they could delete it. He turned to the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been part of an illegal mind control experiment. Maxwell Reed planned to use this concert to manipulate your thoughts to make you support his development plans without question. Murmurs of shock and anger rippled through the crowd. Reed, seeing his control of the situation evaporating, made a desperate move. He pulled a small device from his pocket, a remote trigger of some kind, and held it up for all to see. "Enough!" he shouted, voice hoarse with rage. "This stops now, or I activate the weather control system at full capacity. This valley will be washed away in the worst flood it's ever seen." A tense silence fell. Sophie's song faltered as she looked to Ruth and White Cloud for guidance. The pendant's glow dimmed slightly. "He's bluffing," Lucas said, stepping forward to face his father. "The system isn't designed for that level of atmospheric manipulation. It would destabilize immediately." Reed's expression hardened. "Are you willing to risk the lives of everyone in this room on that belief, son? On the word of a man whose mind has been compromised by that woman?" He gestured contemptuously toward Sophie. "Not compromise," Lucas replied steadily. "Cleared. For the first time in years, I can think without your frequencies interfering. I remember everything now, Father, including what you did to my mother." Reed's finger hovered over the trigger. "Last warning. Everyone leaves Ms. Morgan comes with me, and all copies of that data are destroyed. Or I bring this entire valley down around our ears." A new voice cut through the tension, calm, authoritative, achingly familiar to Sophie. "The system's already been neutralized, Maxwell." All heads turned toward the entrance where a woman stood framed in the doorway, her silhouette illuminated by lightning from the storm outside. She stepped forward into the light, revealing a face Sophie had seen only in photographs and dreams for the past 3 years. Eliza Morgan walked down the center aisle with purposeful strides, her gaze never leaving Reed. She wore practical clothes, hiking boots, cargo pants, a weatherproof jacket, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had nothing left to fear. "Mom!" Sophie whispered, her song forgotten as emotion overwhelmed her. Eliza smiled briefly at her daughter before returning her attention to Reed. "Your weather manipulation system has been disabled. The same counter frequency that disrupts your mind control technology affects the atmospheric processors. They're all offline." As if to confirm her words, the storm outside began to subside, the unnatural intensity of it fading to a gentle rainfall. Sunlight broke through the clouds, sending rays through the hall's high windows. Reed's face contorted with fury. "You," he spat, "you were supposed to be dead." "Many people were supposed to be dead," Eliza replied evenly, "including my daughter if your experiments had continued. Including Lucas's mother, who objected to your use of her son as a test subject." Gasps and murmurs spread through the audience. Lucas stepped forward, shock written across his features. "My mother didn't die in a riot overseas. You told me." "I told you what you needed to believe," Reed snapped. "After she threatened to expose the project, certain memories became inconvenient." Eliza reached the stage, climbing the steps to stand beside Sophie. Her hand found her daughter's, squeezing gently. "It's over, Maxwell. The FBI has been monitoring this entire event. They're outside now with enough evidence to shut down Reed Enterprises permanently." As if on cue, federal agents streamed into the hall, moving swiftly to secure the exits and approach the control booth. Reed looked wildly around, seeking escape, but finding none. "You can't prove anything," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "It's my word against yours. I'm a respected businessman, a philanthropist. You're a discredited researcher who abandoned her own child." "We have all the proof we need," Foster said, holding up the laptop. "Every experiment, every test subject, every application of the technology, it's all here, including the memory modifications performed on Lucas and others without consent." Reed's face went ashen as agents surrounded him. "This isn't over," he hissed as they led him away. "People will see the value of my work eventually. Progress can't be stopped by sentimentality." The hall erupted in a chaos of questions and exclamations as the townspeople tried to make sense of what they had witnessed. Officials huddled with FBI agents providing statements. Musicians packed away their instruments, many looking shaken by the revelation that they had been unwitting accomplices in a mind control scheme. Through it all, Sophie stood motionless, staring at her mother's face, memorizing every detail she had feared forgotten. Eliza looked older, more weathered than in Sophie's memories, with new lines around her eyes and strands of gray in her dark hair. But her eyes were the same, intelligent, determined, and now filled with tears as she gazed at her daughter. "Sophie," she said, her voice breaking, "my brave, brilliant girl. You let me think you were dead," Sophie said, tears streaming down her face. "For 3 years. It was the only way to keep you safe," Eliza replied softly. "Reed would have used you to get to me, used your gift." She touched the pendant at Sophie's throat. "I had to disappear until I could be certain he would be stopped permanently." "I hated you," Sophie admitted, the words catching in her throat. "Our last conversation, I said I hated how you always put the horses first. That was the last thing I said to you before I thought you died." Eliza pulled Sophie into her arms, holding her tightly. "I never put anything before you, Sophie. Everything I did, the research, the risks, even the deception, was to create a world where your gift would be respected, not exploited, where you could be safe." Ruth approached, her stern face softened with emotion. "You cut it rather close, Eliza. Another few minutes and Reed would have had the entire town under his influence." "The storm delayed me," Eliza replied, extending an arm to include her mother in the embrace. "Thank you for keeping her safe, for teaching her the song." The three generations stood together, united at last, as Phantom and Aurora watched over them with intelligent eyes. Around the stage, the remaining audience members began to disperse, led by FBI agents who were taking statements and explaining what had occurred. White Cloud approached, leaning on his walking stick. "The spirit horses have done their part," he said, nodding toward Phantom and Aurora. "Their wisdom has guided you when human wisdom failed." "What happens now?" Sophie asked, looking at the wild horses that had come to their aid. "Now they return to freedom," White Cloud said simply, "as all beings should." Foster joined them, tucking the laptop into a secure case handed to him by an FBI agent. "The evidence is being processed. Reed and his associates will face charges ranging from illegal human experimentation to conspiracy and environmental crimes." "And Lucas?" Sophie asked, looking for Reed's son among the crowd. "He's giving his statement to the authorities," Foster explained. "The medical team will remove his implant once they understand the exact nature of the technology. He'll need time to recover, to sort through which memories are real and which were implanted." Eliza nodded, her expression compassionate. "He was as much a victim as anyone. Reed used his own son as a test subject when Lucas began questioning the ethics of Project Echo." Outside, the storm had cleared completely, leaving a washed-clean sky and the fresh scent of rain. The wild horses that had charged into the concert hall now gathered on the expansive grounds, waiting patiently as if for final instructions. "We should go," Eliza said, looking toward the doors. "There will be questions, investigation statements to make. It could take weeks to sort through the legal aftermath." Sophie followed her gaze to the open doors, to the sunlight and freedom beyond. "Where will we go?" "Home," Ruth said firmly. "Wild Heart is still standing, still ours. And it's time it lived up to its name again," Eliza added with a smile. "A true rehabilitation center, not just for injured horses, but for the bond between humans and animals. Research as it should be, respectful, ethical, focused on connection rather than control." They walked together down the center aisle, past FBI agents documenting the scene, past stunned townspeople still trying to process what they had witnessed. Outside, the wild horses parted to create a path for them, Phantom and Aurora leading the way. In the fresh air and sunlight, Sophie took a deep breath, her lungs expanding fully, her asthma temporarily forgotten in the rush of emotion and release. The pendant at her throat had ceased glowing, but remained warm against her skin, a constant reminder of the connection it represented. "How does it work?" she asked her mother as they walked. "The pendant, the song, the connection to the horses. How is it possible?" Eliza smiled, the scientist in her emerging through the emotion. "The pendant is made from a rare mineral found only in this valley. It naturally resonates at a frequency that amplifies certain neural patterns, the same patterns that enable the connection between humans with our particular genetic makeup and horses with the ancient bloodline." "Like Phantom and Aurora," Sophie said, watching the two horses walking ahead of them. "Exactly. The song is a tool, a way of focusing those neural patterns into a coherent signal. Our ancestors discovered it generations ago, though they wouldn't have understood the science behind it." Eliza glanced at White Cloud with respect. They simply knew it worked, that it created a bridge between species. And Reed corrupted it, Ruth added grimly. Twisted it from communication into control. That's what I couldn't allow, Eliza confirmed. The technology itself isn't inherently evil. It could revolutionize how we understand animal cognition, how we heal trauma in both humans and animals. But in the wrong hands. It became a weapon, Sophie finished. They reached Ruth's truck, still parked where she and White Cloud had left it near the estate's entrance. The wild horses gathered around them in a loose circle, with Phantom and Aurora standing closest. What about them? Sophie asked, reaching out to stroke Aurora's golden neck. What happens to all these horses? They return to the mountains, White Cloud said. To freedom, where they belong. Even Aurora, Sophie asked, a pang of loss already tightening her chest. She's just a baby. She was hurt. She has healed, the elder replied gently, and she has her father to protect her now. He nodded toward Phantom, who stood watchful at Aurora's side. Eliza placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder. The bond you formed with her won't be broken by distance, Sophie. The connection once established remains. She'll always know you always hear your call if you truly need her. Sophie moved to Aurora, pressing her forehead against the filly's soft muzzle. I'll miss you, she whispered. Aurora nickered softly, her breath warm against Sophie's skin. For a moment, that strange connection flared again. Images of open plains, of running free beneath blue skies, of returning sometimes to the edge of the valley to watch from a distance. She'll come back to visit, Sophie said with certainty, stepping back. When she can. Phantom approached, his dark eyes fixed on Sophie with that ancient wisdom she had first seen in her dreams. He lowered his head, allowing her to touch the space between his eyes, a gesture of profound trust from a wild creature. Thank you, Sophie said softly, for protecting her, for helping us. The black stallion tossed his head once, then turned, trotting toward the open field. Aurora followed, and behind them, the entire wild herd began to move, a flowing river of horses streaming toward the mountains and freedom. Sophie watched them go, her heart full of contradictory emotions, joy at their freedom, sadness at the parting, hope for their future, gratitude for their help. As the last horse disappeared over the ridge, she turned back to her family. Let's go home, she said. One year later, Shadow Creek Valley bloomed under a perfect autumn sky. The drought had broken with the natural rains that followed the dismantling of Reed's weather manipulation technology. Fields that had been brown and parched now grew lush with grass and wildflowers. The town square bustled with activity as the annual Horse Harvest Festival got underway, though it had been thoroughly reimagined in the wake of last year's events. Gone was the auction block, where wild horses had once been sold to the highest bidder. In its place stood educational exhibits about equine conservation, sustainable ranching practices, and the unique ecology of the valley. Sophie moved through the crowd, greeting townsfolk who now smiled and waved, where once they had whispered behind her back. At 12, she had grown taller over the past year, her confidence blossoming along with her height. The silver pendant still hung around her neck, a permanent reminder of all that had occurred. The Wild Heart Rehabilitation and Research Center, as it was now called, had become the festival's centerpiece. Under Eliza's leadership and with Foster's assistance, it had been transformed into a state-of-the-art facility dedicated to studying the connection between humans and horses, developing therapies for both species, and preserving the valley's unique equine heritage. Reed Enterprises had been dismantled following its founder's conviction on multiple federal charges. Maxwell Reed now resided in a maximum security prison, his empire dissolved, his research confiscated, and carefully monitored by ethical oversight committees. The mansion that had once dominated the valley had been converted into a community center and museum documenting both the valley's natural history and the near disaster of Project Echo. Sophie found her mother at the center's exhibition booth, demonstrating to a group of fascinated children how horses communicate through subtle body language. Eliza looked up as Sophie approached, her face lighting with a smile that still seemed miraculous after so many years of absence. Just in time, Eliza said, beckoning her daughter forward. I was telling these young scientists about our special research volunteers. The children turned expectant faces towards Sophie, who had become something of a local legend over the past year. She smiled, dropping to one knee to address them at eye level. "Who wants to learn the special song?" she asked. Eager hands shot into the air, accompanied by a chorus of excited voices. Sophie began to hum the ancient melody, encouraging the children to join in. Most couldn't replicate it perfectly. The gift for the true echo remained rare, but they participated enthusiastically nonetheless. As their young voices rose in approximate harmony, a murmur spread through the crowd. Sophie looked up to see people pointing toward the ridge that bordered the valley to the north. There, silhouetted against the clear blue sky, stood a line of wild horses watching the festival from a distance. At the center of the line, a black stallion stood, proud and tall phantom, instantly recognizable even at this distance. Beside him, her golden coat catching the sunlight like a flame. Aurora had grown into a beautiful yearling, her form elegant and strong. Sophie rose to her feet, the children forgotten as she moved to the edge of the square, her eyes fixed on the distant horses. Her hand rose to the pendant at her throat, which warmed at her touch. She began to sing the melody in earnest, now her clear voice carrying across the valley. To the amazement of the festival goers, Phantom reared up on his hind legs, pawing the air in what seemed like greeting or acknowledgement. Aurora mirrored the gesture, smaller, but no less magnificent. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the wild herd turned and disappeared back over the ridge, returning to their mountain freedom. "They remember," Ruth said, appearing at Sophie's side. The past year had been kind to her. With the burden of secrets lifted, she had regained much of her former vigor. "They always will." Lucas joined them, looking healthier than Sophie had ever seen him. The removal of Reed's implant and subsequent therapy had restored him fully, though the process of reconciling his true memories with the false ones had been painful. He had stayed in Shadow Creek, working with Eliza to understand and reverse his father's technology. "The monitoring stations picked up their approach an hour ago," he said. "They've been doing this more frequently, coming to the edge of the valley, watching for a while, then returning to the wild." "It's their choice now," Sophie said, a smile touching her lips. "That's what matters. They come because they want to, not because anyone controls them." Eliza nodded, pride evident in her eyes as she looked at her daughter. "Freedom with connection," she said. "That's the balance we've always sought. Not dominance, not separation, but mutual respect and choice." As if to punctuate her words, a distant call echoed from the ridge, Phantom's distinctive voice carrying across the valley, like a reminder, like a promise. "The wild call," White Cloud said, joining their small circle. Despite his advancing years, he stood straight and strong, his weathered face peaceful. "It never truly ends. It only changes form, generation to generation, heart to heart." Sophie closed her eyes, feeling the pendant warm against her skin, the ancient melody humming through her bones. The connection remained a living thread, binding her to the wild horses, to the land, to her family, past, present, and future. In that moment, standing in the sunlight with her mother and grandmother beside her, Sophie knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever new form the echo might take in years to come, they would face it together. The broken chain had been mended, the scattered family reunited, the silenced voice restored. The wild call had been answered, and in that answer, they had all found freedom. That evening, as twilight painted the valley in shades of gold and purple, 3 generations of women stood on the porch of the Wild Heart Center, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Ruth sat in her rocking chair, a crocheted blanket across her lap, despite the mild temperature. Eliza leaned against the porch railing, her face relaxed in a way it hadn't been for years. Sophie sat on the steps, chin resting on her knees, gaze fixed on the distant ridge where the wild horses had appeared. "Do you think they'll come back tomorrow?" she asked, not turning around. "Perhaps," Eliza replied. "They seem to be establishing a pattern, visiting at festival time, when the valley is most active." "Keeping an eye on us," Ruth snorted, though there was affection in her tone. "Making sure we humans don't start getting foolish ideas again." Sophie smiled, fingering the pendant at her throat. Over the past year, she had learned to control her connection to it, to use it judiciously rather than letting it overwhelm her. Eliza had been a patient teacher, helping Sophie understand her gift, while ensuring she had a normal childhood alongside it. The sound of tires on gravel announced Foster's arrival. He emerged from his truck carrying several file folders, his expression animated with excitement. The results came back from the university lab, he announced as he climbed the porch steps. They've confirmed what we suspected about the genetic markers. The ability to access the echo frequencies is hereditary, but it requires both the genetic predisposition and proper training to fully manifest. Nature and nurture working in harmony, Eliza mused, taking one of the folders and scanning its contents. Just as we theorized. More importantly, Foster continued, they've found no harmful side effects from the natural echo connection. Unlike Reed's artificial version, the true frequency creates no dependency, no cognitive distortions. It's pure communication. Communication that could change how humans and animals interact forever. Eliza added, her eyes alight with scientific passion. If we can refine the techniques, document the results properly, one step at a time, Ruth cautioned, though she too looked intrigued by the findings. We've seen what happens when discovery outpaces wisdom. Sophie listened to their discussion with half an ear, her attention drawn to a movement at the edge of the property. A golden shape emerged from the shadows of the trees, hesitant yet purposeful. Aurora. Without a word, Sophie rose and descended the porch steps. The adults fell silent, watching as she walked slowly across the yard toward the young horse. Aurora remained at the property's edge, ears pricked forward, body tense, and ready to flee if necessary. Sophie stopped several yards away, respecting the filly's space, her wild nature. She didn't call or gesture, simply stood in quiet acknowledgement of Aurora's presence. After a long moment, Aurora took a step forward, then another. She moved with the fluid grace of a wild thing, no longer the frightened, injured filly who had arrived at their barn a year ago. When she reached Sophie, she lowered her head, blowing softly against the girl's outstretched hand. "Hello, friend," Sophie whispered. Behind Aurora, deeper shadows moved in the trees, Phantom keeping watch from a distance, allowing this reunion, but remaining vigilant. Sophie nodded in his direction, a gesture of respect and gratitude that the black stallion acknowledged with a toss of his magnificent head. The moment stretched peaceful and profound, wild and domestic in perfect balance, neither seeking to control the other. Then with a soft, nickering sound, Aurora turned and trotted back toward the trees, rejoining her father. Together they melted into the gathering darkness, returning to their wild freedom. Sophie walked back to the porch, her heart full. "She remembers," she said simply. "Of course she does," Eliza replied, putting an arm around her daughter's shoulders. "Some bonds transcend circumstance. They become part of who we are." Ruth reached out, taking Sophie's hand in her weathered one. "3 generations," she said softly. "Guardians of the echo, keepers of the bond, and teachers for the next generation." Eliza added, gesturing toward the town where children who had learned the melody today would carry it with them, perhaps passing it to their own children someday. As if in response to her words, a distant call echoed from the mountains. Phantom's voice carried on the evening breeze. It was answered by willow and thunder, from the barn then, by other horses throughout the valley, domestic and wild alike, their voices blending in an ancient chorus that needed no human interpretation. The wild call spanning generations, bridging worlds, promising that as long as there were those who listened with open hearts, the connection between humans and horses would never truly be lost. It would evolve, transform, adapt to changing times, but at its core it would remain what it had always been, a reminder of our capacity for communication beyond words, for connection beyond boundaries, for freedom within relationship. Sophie closed her eyes, letting the chorus wash over her, feeling the pendant warm against her skin. In that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that whatever the future held, she would never again be alone. The broken chain had been mended, the scattered family reunited, the silenced voice restored. And in that restoration, they had all found their way home. Some bonds transcend understanding. They live in the spaces between words and melodies, carried on mountain winds in the silent recognition, between species separated by evolution, but united by something deeper. Sophie Morgan's journey from broken child to guardian of the echo reminds us of what we've forgotten in our rush toward progress, that connection doesn't require control, that the most profound relationships are those built on freedom and choice, not dominance and possession. 3 generations of women stand now where once a single child stood alone. The pendant that once symbolized loss now represents continuity, a chain unbroken despite time and deception. The horses that once represented abandonment now embody the perfect balance between intimacy and independence. Perhaps we all carry some version of the echo within us, some capacity to hear beyond words, to feel beyond touch, to understand beyond explanation. Perhaps what separates us from the wild is not our capacity for language, but our reluctance to listen for the quieter truths that exist beneath it. As twilight settles over Shadow Creek Valley and wild horses stand silhouetted against the darkening sky, one question lingers, like the last note of an ancient song. What calls to you from the wilderness of your own heart? And when it calls, will you have the courage to answer? For in that answer lies not just freedom, but the rarest gift of all, coming home to yourself.